program in the 21st Century Cures Act. I look forward to working with my colleagues on the subcommittee to address many of the proposal's shortcomings and to provide greater clarity for their patients, their doctors, and innovators by passing H.R. 1691, the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthrough Products Act. This would provide patients more predictable access to FDA-approved breakthrough devices if certain conditions are met. Congress should also act to ensure patients are able to access these therapies by identifying reimbursement models that drive value. For example, the Medicare Advantage program could lead in adoption of value-based contracting for certain drugs or therapies. In addition to novel therapies, we now have diagnostic tools that can help us detect diseases sooner, such as multi-cancer screening diagnostics, leading to improved patient outcomes and savings to the healthcare system. These tools represent another opportunity to ensure our Medicare policies strike the appropriate balance of increasing access while driving higher quality care. In closing, with a finite number of Medicare resources and an aging population, it is absolutely imperative for policymakers to ensure we are appropriately striking the balance of rewarding innovation while providing access to quality care in a way that doesn't bankrupt the system. That concludes my opening statement, and I yield back, and the chair will recognize the gentlelady from California for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, colleagues, and welcome to all of our witnesses. The New York Times Magazine last month declared the following, quote, "It looks like we're in a golden age for medicine. Thanks to breakthroughs in mapping the human genome, advancing mRNA technology, and creating multi-cancer blood tests and other new diagnostics, we're on the cusp of seeing life-saving innovations for some of the most intractable diseases. This potential golden age is why I work so hard with all of the members of this subcommittee to create the Advanced Research Projects Agency for Health, ARPA-H, which we got over the finish line last year. And that is designed to accelerate research and development to bring more cures to really the most intractable diseases, those diseases that when someone is diagnosed is essentially a death sentence. However, the R&D pipeline doesn't end with a successful clinical trial or FDA approval. To bring cures from the benchtop to the bedside, patients need Medicare to cover new drugs and devices. But the Medicare coverage determination process can be lengthy. According to the Stanford Bayer Center for Biodesign, nationwide Medicare coverage for breakthrough medical technologies can take, on average, 4 to 6 years following FDA authorization. Medicare has tried to speed up coverage decisions through a pathway called Coverage with Evidence Development, or CED. A CED allows for Medicare to cover a new drug or device more quickly while still collecting information about whether the new drug or device is reasonable and necessary for Medicare beneficiaries. In theory, a CED sounds like a reasonable compromise. Medicare beneficiaries get timely access to new breakthroughs, while the Medicare program receives more information about how the treatments work in the real world. In practice, however, there's been a wide variability in the implementation of a CED. Some therapies in a CED have had no data collection mechanisms. That means no one could actually receive coverage for the treatment. So that's a bust in plain English. Other therapies have had registries to collect the patient data, but they were too costly or burdensome for the doctors, leading to inequities in coverage. This unpredictability in CED requirements is partly why there was such a huge outcry over CMS announcing that it would require a CED for new Alzheimer's treatments. Patients weren't sure how they were going to get the care they need. It's also unclear when a CED requirement will end. Out of the 26 treatments that have CEDs, only 4 have had their data collection requirements retired. For the CED process to be successful, CMS needs to issue clear policy and provide more predictable timelines. CMS will also need resources and expert staff to make coverage decisions. That's why I was really horrified to see that the House Republicans released last week a draft fiscal year 24 LHHS appropriations bill that cuts nearly $800 million from CMS. $800 million. That's a whopping amount of money that provides resources for what's necessary. These cuts are going to hurt seniors by making them face longer wait time for Medicare. Industry can do its part by planning earlier for how to provide the evidence Medicare needs for coverage. More diverse clinical trials will help speed up CMS coverage decisions. And that's why my DEPICT Act that passed last year required drug and drug makers to plan to include more diverse populations in their pivotal clinical trials. With over 65 million Americans enrolled in Medicare, every coverage decision is fraught. Medicare beneficiaries deserve access to safe, effective, and affordable treatments. So I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today. You are a panel of experts and on how Medicare can better achieve the balance that I have hopefully drawn out where the kinks are and how we can do much better for them. They're counting on us to make sure this really does take place for them. So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back her time. The chair will now recognize the chair of the full committee, Chair Rogers, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I, too, am grateful to all who are here, those that will be testifying, and it's just great to see the committee room packed out for this hearing. America is the global leader in medical innovation. It's truly an American success story. Today, there's more than 160,000 clinical trials taking place around the country. That's more than the European Union, Australia, and South America combined. That means hope for patients with diseases like spinal muscular atrophy, Alzheimer's, ALS, and many others. It means hope that a treatment or cure is likely to be studied and approved in the U.S. first. But it does not necessarily mean that patients in the U.S. will have access to these breakthroughs first. Today, we will discuss how to remedy government policies standing in the way or slowing down patient access to treatments and cures. I think about how America was home to one of the first successful treatments for sickle cell disease and multiple sclerosis. In 2010, a woman named Jennifer Century underwent a then experimental procedure that changed the course of her life. For 10 years following her stem cell transplant, her quality of life improved in ways she never imagined possible. She walked miles a day, and had hope for the future. Tragically, Jennifer passed away from COVID-19 in 2022, but she left a legacy of advocating for other sickle cell patients in hope for a cure. Imagine having sickle cell disease or other diseases, knowing there's a possible cure and not being able to access it. Unfortunately, in 2016, CMS issued a National Coverage Determination, or NCD, that might prevent others from accessing the same treatment. And these decisions to limit coverage, like the one for the new Alzheimer's treatments, discourage innovation that could help patients and improve people's lives. As our competitors like China continue to invest more money in biotechnology, it is crucial that we maintain our competitive edge so that people continue to look to the United States of America for life-saving medical products and treatments. As such, I remain extremely concerned about the impact of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act price controls on innovation and the $3 billion that was given to CMS. I hope that Democrats heed the warnings of outside experts who see lost innovation happening in real time and work with us to mitigate the damage before it's too late. Bipartisan concerns over CMS's heavy-handed coverage policies present us with an opportunity to work together to ensure seniors can access new and innovative treatments. For example, I look forward to hearing from our witnesses about how we can strengthen the CMS TSET proposal. There appears to be some good in the notice, but I remain concerned about the uncertainty for patients and doctors created by CMS's lack of transparency, accountable timelines, and a predictable coverage pathway for FDA-approved technologies. That said, I remain encouraged by the strong bipartisan support for key policies in the previous administration's Medicare coverage of innovative technology, the MCET rule. I believe it will help us come together to strengthen TSET proposal for patients. Predictability in these coverage pathways is also important for American leadership in cures and treatments. Predictability is compromised when a healthcare bureaucracy is tasked with determining whether a treatment is reasonable and necessary for Medicare patients. Take the example of how Alzheimer's afflicts the Medicare population, namely millions of Americans over 65 and people with disabilities like Down syndrome. First of their kind medicines were brought to the market, and CMS decided that these medicines and any future ones like them did not meet the reasonable and necessary standard for those that depend on Medicare for coverage. This is unacceptable. Not only did CMS cut off access for the very population their medicines were intended to treat, but it also stopped innovation in the tracks by passing judgment on products that do not yet exist or whose clinical outcomes were under review. In a self-fulfilling prophecy, by saying future products won't be covered, CMS is ensuring investors will never take the risks necessary to bring them to market. I want to provide hope, all of us do, hope to all patients, like those with sickle cell disease, MS, or Alzheimer's, that a cure or treatment is on the way. We want an innovation ecosystem that constantly seeks new cures, new treatments, and new ways to help people. That is the promise of America, where hope turns into real life-saving breakthroughs. So again, thank you to the witnesses. I look forward to hearing your ideas as how we can make these processes work better for patients. I yield back.
Thank you. The chair yields back. The chair will now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes for an opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And, I just have to say that I do hear constantly from the other side, from the Republican side, criticism of CMS, FDA, and all these agencies that, in my opinion, are really the key to our success in innovation. I mean, also at the same time, efforts on the Republican side to cut back on research dollars for these agencies like the CMS and FDA. I mean, we can't rely on pharma and the private sector to, solely develop new drugs. I mean, they're driven by profit. They're driven by how much money they can make. And they're not, sure, they're worried about safety because they want to make sure that their drugs are safe, otherwise people won't buy them. But we can't just constantly say, CMS is bad, CMS shouldn't have any money, and then say, okay, pharma and the industry is going to take care of everything. It doesn't work that way. They have to work together. And we have to be monitoring both the federal agencies as well as the private sector to make sure that they're well funded and that they have that they're conscious of safety in their effort to bring drugs to market. And I think that I don't want to constantly remind the other side, but you need them to work hand in hand and not just say that the public sector is the bad guys. In any case, let me just talk about the issue at hand here. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services plays an important role in ensuring that Medicare beneficiaries can access innovative medical technologies and treatments in a timely manner. CMS does all this while maintaining appropriate safeguards that prioritize the health and well-being of our nation's seniors and the disabled. And this is particularly critical since we have seen an acceleration of scientific breakthroughs over the last few decades. We're extremely fortunate to live at a time when biomedical sciences have become so advanced and medical knowledge has progressed to allow the creation of cures and treatments to address and slow the progression of devastating diseases, including Alzheimer's. Today, nearly 6.7 million Americans are living with Alzheimer's disease, and unfortunately, that number is expected to increase by 214 million by 2060. And these numbers are sobering, and virtually no one in this country will be spared from the devastating impact of Alzheimer's. So I was pleased to see Medicare provide broad coverage of lecanemab following the FDA's decision to grant traditional approval. Medicare covers lecanemab more broadly at this point than any other payer, while facilitating the collection of real-world evidence through a patient registry. And I'm hopeful the drug will live up to its promise of slowing the progression of Alzheimer's disease for patients. Because of the nature of clinical trials, the approval studies left important questions unanswered about how Medicare beneficiaries as a whole will do on this medication. Both the FDA and the neurology community have cautioned about safety in certain patient groups and the potential deadly side effects the drugs can cause. And as a result, CMS is asking doctors who prescribe the drug to provide clinical data through a free registry. This registry will allow doctors and patients access to all the information they need to make the right decisions about this treatment and others like it. And I believe CMS has taken the right approach, leaving clinical decision-making between patients and doctors while addressing current evidence gaps to better understand the benefits and side effects associated with the drug. And I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today about the proposed registry, as well as opportunities for improvement to ensure that it collects the right information at the right time and does not hinder beneficiary access. Now, CMS has also proposed a process for covering breakthrough devices in the Medicare program while ensuring the collection of real-world evidence to fill any evidence gaps. And the collection and review of this evidence will also allow CMS to adjust coverage decisions based on new developments. We must also recognize that treatments and cures only work when patients can afford them. Lecanemab costs $26,500 per year. That's nearly the annual income of the average Medicare beneficiary. And the pharmaceutical industry must stop putting profits over patients and ensure seniors have access to effective treatments and medications that are affordable. So I thank our witnesses for being here today. I look forward to your testimony. And with that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The ranking member yields back. So now we'll move to witnesses' opening testimony. I think most of you have testified before, but you know that you have 5 minutes for your opening statement. There's a lighting system. 4 minutes into your opening statement, you'll see a yellow light. And means you're approaching the end. When you see the red light, it's to wrap up if you're beyond that. But we appreciate you guys being here today. So what I'll do is introduce all of you, and then we'll call on you one at a time to move forward. So the witnesses we have before us today is Dr. Natalia Rost, President-elect of the American Academy of Neurology, Dr. Thomas MacGillivray, President of the Society of Thoracic Surgeons. I believe we have a thoracic surgeon on our committee, don't we, Dr. Bouchon? Yeah. So he's your president now, huh? Dr. Lishan Aklog, Chairman and CEO of PAVmed. Dr. Todd Brinton, Corporate Vice President and Advanced Technology Chief Scientific Officer for Edward Lifesciences. Ms. Sue Ronsky, Alzheimer's Association Advocate, and Dr. Brian Miller, non-resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and Assistant Professor of Medicine at Johns Hopkins University School of Medicine. So we'll begin with Dr. Rost, and Dr. Rost, you're recognized for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, everybody. First, let me thank Chairwoman Rogers, Ranking Member Pallone, Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and the members of the subcommittee for the invitation to represent the American Academy of Neurology on this important topic. My name is Dr. Natalia Rost. I'm a vascular neurologist, chief of the stroke division at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and professor of neurology at Harvard Medical School. In addition to my roles at Harvard and MGH, I'm particularly proud of my career-long service to the American Academy of Neurology, or AAN, where I currently serve as president-elect and vice chair of the Committee on Public Engagement. The AAN is the world's largest neurology specialty society, representing more than 40,000 neurologists and clinical neuroscience professionals. Our priority is to provide the highest quality, patient-centric neurologic care for all in need. For years, the disorders our profession treated, such as stroke, epilepsy, dementia, MS, Parkinson's, ALS, traumatic brain injury, muscular dystrophy, and many others, had little hope of a cure. Today, science has progressed to the point where we have innovative therapies that can slow or stop the progress of many of the conditions we treat, giving new hope to our patients and their families. One such area where we have seen innovation bringing potential hope is the development of monoclonal antibody treatments directed against amyloid for Alzheimer's disease. Our members know all too well the burden this disease places on our patients and their families. We fully understand the promise these new treatments hold, yet we remain concerned about the potential for dangerous side effects and the need for additional data on their impact on certain patient populations. Thus, we have been eager to provide our expertise to CMS as they have considered how to cover these new treatments. In fact, the AAN has been engaged with CMS on these new therapies for more than 2 years, with the goal of ensuring appropriate access to these treatments. We engaged with CMS as they made initial coverage determinations about aducanumab, the first treatment to receive accelerated approval for this drug class. And many of our suggestions were included in the final coverage determination. However, there are 2 key areas where we had concerns with CMS's final decision. First, given the first-in-class effect, where we were concerned that the initial coverage determination would apply to all drugs in a class without consideration of the potential clinical benefit they could demonstrate. Second, we were concerned the coverage determination did not include a clear off-ramp for patients for whom questions of efficacy and safety have been clearly addressed. It is because of these concerns that in February of 2023, following the publication of evidence relating to the safety and efficacy of lecanemab, that the AAN submitted a request to CMS that they would reconsider their current coverage determination for this class of drugs. Following that submission, we engaged directly with the agency to refine our request and provide CMS with actionable recommendations. The result of those conversations was the amended formal reconsideration request we submitted to CMS on June 12th of this year. There are 2 key asks in this amended reconsideration request. First, the AAN asked that a subset of patients for whom there is conclusive peer-reviewed evidence available demonstrating the safety and effectiveness of lecanemab be removed from the CED requirements. Second, we request that an off-ramp be clearly delineated to allow newly gathered evidence collected to be expeditiously taken into account so that the patients can be quickly removed from the study requirements as appropriate based on the evidence. We're grateful to CMS for engaging in a constructive dialogue with us throughout this process, and we hope it will result in positive changes for the benefit of our patients, their families, and their communities. We believe that our experience in providing feedback and working with stakeholders throughout this process can shed light on lessons learned, opportunities for improvement to further promote appropriate patient access to innovative treatments. While considering how the Medicare-eligible populations can access innovative treatments, the AAN hopes the committee will also consider additional factors that are likely to restrict patient access. Among them, the physician, and in this case, particular neurology workforce shortage, increased use of utilization management tools by payers such as prior authorization and step therapy protocols, and the high out-of-pocket costs for these treatments will also create serious barriers to access. I would like to reiterate the AAN's gratitude to the subcommittee for inviting me here today and to CMS for their continued willingness to work with the Academy to find the best path forward to promote coverage of these new therapies to help our members deliver the best possible care to their patients in need. We look forward to continuing our engagement with the subcommittee on this important issue. Thank you.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes Dr. MacGillivray for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning. Chair Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the committee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today on this very important topic. My name is Dr. Thomas MacGillivray. I'm a heart surgeon, chair of the Department of Cardiac Surgery at MedStar Washington Hospital Center, and president of the Society of Thoracic Surgeons, also known as the STS. Founded in 1964, the STS is a professional medical association of almost 8,000 surgeons and allied health professionals who operate on and care for babies, children, and adults with cardiothoracic disease, from cradle to cane. The STS National Database has become the gold standard of clinical registries. Established in 1989, our database now contains 9.4 million cardiothoracic surgery operations, including 98% of all cardiac surgeries performed in the United States by 4,000 surgeons. With this data, cardiothoracic surgeons can evaluate their own patient outcomes, measure their performance against national benchmarks, and implement changes for quality improvement. You may ask, why are clinical registries like the STS database important for coverage decisions? Well, let's look at the example of transcatheter aortic valve replacement, or TAVR, a less invasive therapy to treat aortic valve disease that otherwise has been managed by open heart surgery. When TAVR was first approved by Medicare for coverage with evidence development in 2012, it was only for extremely high-risk patients. At that time, the STS, collaborating with the American College of Cardiology, created the TVT registry to monitor patient safety related to this new therapy. The TVT registry was approved by CMS to meet the registry requirements outlined in the NCD. The TAVR procedure is an exceptional example of how tying national coverage determination to coverage with evidence development requirements can both validate the effectiveness of emerging therapies as well as expand access based on ongoing real-world data. Over time, more and more patients were able to receive this new therapy based on the data collected in the TVT registry. Recently, the administration issued the Transitional Coverage of Emerging Technologies Notice that would create an alternative, expedited pathway to payment coverage for emerging devices and diagnostics. It is important that reforms strike a balance between providing access to innovative therapy while also ensuring that the collection of robust evidence is available to best inform these coverage decisions. The STS believes that reforms to coverage of emerging therapies should include the following provisions. First, to prioritize the collection of real-world data, particularly for new innovative medical devices. Secondly, to permit early discussions and coordination between the FDA, CMS, and all relevant stakeholders to allow sufficient time for the appropriate design, application, and implementation of any CED requirements. We'd also hope that it would provide flexibility for data collection mechanisms that can be adjusted based on new observations and developments in the evidence. And lastly, to provide registries with timely, affordable, and continuous access to Medicare claims data that facilitates longitudinal studies to show efficacy and value. In the STS's experience with the TVT registry, it has shown that CED helps protect patients while offering timely access to innovative therapies. Randomized clinical trials are important, but these findings from small, pre-market clinical trials with carefully selected patients at carefully selected sites do not always generalize to widespread application. Without ongoing real-world evidence collection, the appropriateness, safety, and efficacy of innovative therapies will remain uncertain. And this uncertainty will not only impair physicians, but more importantly, the ability for patients to make the best healthcare decisions. Thank you very much for the privilege of being here.
Thank you, Dr. MacGillivray. The chair will recognize Dr. Aklog for 5 minutes for your opening statement. Thank you.
Chairman Guthrie and Ranking Member Eshoo, I'm honored to be here. My name is Dr. Lishan Aklog. I'm also a heart surgeon, but I'm an entrepreneur and small company chief executive. I also serve on the PAVmed board and chair its Health Equity Committee. Let me first thank you for leading with the title with the words, "Innovation Saves Lives." This factual statement has defined my entire professional career. Although medical technology innovation has saved millions of lives, the arduous process of translating innovation into equitable access to life-saving products lacks transparency and predictability. As a first-generation American who fled political violence in Ethiopia as a young boy, I am proud that America remains the world's engine for medical technology innovation. Most of this innovation, fueled by our entrepreneurial spirit, occurs in small companies, where our ability to raise capital is predicated on a transparent and predictable process. Government, including Congress, must keep pace and adjust. For example, thanks to improvements in the transparency and predictability of FDA processes, Europeans are no longer the first beneficiary of groundbreaking American medical technologies. We need similar improvements to Medicare coverage processes. Let me offer some concrete examples from my own experience. 10 years ago, I transitioned from heart surgeon to co-founder, chairman, and CEO of PAVmed, a now NASDAQ-listed diversified medical technology company with 2 subsidiaries and 130 employees. One subsidiary, Lucid Diagnostics, has commercialized groundbreaking cancer prevention technology developed by NCI investigators at Case Western Reserve University. NCI itself highlighted it as a, quote, one of the year's significant advances in cancer prevention in its 2020 report to Congress. NCI was right. EsoGuard is the world's first and only molecular diagnostic test that can accurately detect early-stage precancer. Before this hearing ends, 24 or so Americans will receive a likely death sentence. Their executioner will be esophageal cancer, our second most lethal cancer. Over 10,000 Medicare beneficiaries will succumb to it this year. Even stage 1 disease carries a 50% mortality. We can prevent cancer and save lives by detecting esophageal precancer before it progresses to cancer, consistent with the goals of the 21st Century's Cures Act and the Cancer Moonshot. In 2 recent studies, EsoGuard detected 100% of cancers and over 80% of precancers. These unprecedented early cancer detection results demonstrate EsoGuard's promise as a widespread cancer detection tool, precancer detection tool. So here's a real-world example. An elderly gentleman, Steve, read a poster in his doctor's office and discovered he was at risk for esophageal precancer. He requested an EsoGuard test, which was positive. Further testing confirmed a very late-stage precancer. He completed curative treatment and with monitoring should remain cancer-free. Steve said, "I am damn lucky. I think I saved my own life." He did. But without access to our innovative technology, he very likely would have progressed and died of esophageal cancer. So, innovation saved Steve's life. But his story illustrates some of our challenges. We've been working with CMS and the MAC, which oversees molecular diagnostics, for 4 years. We secured a Medicare payment rate 3 years ago. The coverage process, however, has dragged on through years of uncertainty and long stretches of total silence before recently starting to progress. Although Lucid has raised and deployed over $100 million of capital, this lack of transparency and predictability makes raising capital much more difficult than it should be for such promising technology. It also leads to health inequities. Compared to Medicare, our path to commercial coverage is much more transparent and predictable. Sometime soon, a 64-year-old man with commercial insurance will likely have access to the technology that saved Steve's life, but his 66-year-old brother on Medicare will probably not. The committee's work on HR 1691 and TSET can help establish a transparent and predictable path to transitional Medicare coverage to ensure equitable access to life-saving technologies. Let me highlight 3 serious concerns over TSET. TSET currently excludes diagnostics. There's really no justification for this. Molecular diagnostic testing is at the leading edge of innovation. Our experience is a testament to the fact that the MAC-led coverage process for diagnostics is neither transparent nor predictable. Number 2, TSET does not currently provide a viable plan to update the decades-old defined benefit category system to keep pace with new horizons of innovation, such as digital health. And number 3, CMS anticipates a small fixed number of TSET slots per year. This will not work. It effectively asks companies to buy a TSET lottery ticket and hope their number hits. This will wipe out any improvements in predictability and lead to new inequities, favoring certain groups of patients over others. So I'd like to close by thanking the HR 1691 co-sponsors, and I'm grateful that this committee is strongly engaged on this issue on a bipartisan basis. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate your testimony. The chair will now recognize Dr. Brinton for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Good morning, Chair Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and distinguished members of the committee. My name is Todd Brinton. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer and Corporate Vice President of Advanced Technology for Edwards Lifesciences. Edwards is the global leader of patient-focused innovations for structural heart disease and critical care monitoring. It is a privilege to be here on behalf of Edwards, and I want to first applaud the committee for recognizing the need to provide patients with more timely access to life-saving technologies. I started my own career as a biomedical engineer and later attended medical school, eventually spending 14 years on faculty at Stanford University as a practicing interventional cardiologist and clinical professor of medicine. Combining my passion for patient care and innovation has taught me the critical need for cutting-edge technologies and how it can improve millions of lives. This continues today in my role at Edwards, where we are committed to delivering life-saving innovations to patients. We are passionate about helping patients like Jill Poole, who suffers from heart failure. Jill is a 66-year-old registered nurse who has worked for the VA for more than 30 years. She has always been active, but about 5 years ago, she started to experience symptoms that forced her to slow down. When she sought medical help, Jill was told there was no treatment options for her extremely common type of heart failure. Eventually, Jill was referred to Dr. Faraz Zar at Oregon Health Sciences University Hospital, who believed she might be a good candidate for an investigational device for heart failure sponsored by Edwards in an early feasibility trial. After careful consideration, Jill consented to join the trial. Jill's story is not unique. Heart failure impacts more than 6 million Americans and is the top cause of U.S. hospitalizations, costing the system billions of dollars. In 2021, Jill underwent her procedure, and soon after, she walked in a parade to honor her late father, going from struggling to put on her own shoes to marching in the parade. She's back to gardening and taking care of her family and the veterans she helps at work. For patients like Jill, streamlining the process to make coverage of breakthrough medical technologies more transparent and efficient can help ensure the medical technology innovation ecosystem continues to deliver new life-saving therapies. At Edwards, the innovation process is paired with our commitment to evidence development. Evidence helps us understand how therapies and procedures evolve over time and further improve patient outcomes. Medical device technology and pharmaceuticals are different. Simply stated, once drugs are developed and approved, they're in their final form. Conversely, for medical technology like our transcatheter heart valve therapies, we are constantly learning how to improve the procedure and iterate the device. Clinicians learn and improve their skills with medical technology over time. TAVR, an innovative procedure which enables replacement of a patient's aortic heart valve without open heart surgery, has provided us a unique perspective on coverage of innovative technologies. Edwards worked with FDA, CMS, the medical and patient communities, and others to ensure that it was used safely and appropriately. CMS recognized the need for a heart team to evaluate and treat patients and implemented the coverage with evidence development for us to work with providers to collect registry data aligned with FDA's post-market requirements. While we continue to be concerned about the large amount of registry information being collected creating a burden, we believe that TAVR Experience is a great success story. The registry helps generate meaningful evidence to support continuous innovation and advancements in TAVR technology and expand patient access. While imperfect, the data collection has identified disparities in patient access to transcatheter heart interventions, particularly in rural and underrepresented communities whose hospitals don't have the resources to meet the current NCD requirements. We remain committed to ensure all patients have access to transcatheter heart procedures and high-quality care. We look forward to working with the committee to address the system-wide access disparities. In a positive step, CMS issued a proposed guidance for transitional coverage for emerging technologies for FDA-designated breakthrough devices. A voluntary, timely, and predictable coverage process will allow CMS to achieve its goal of providing Medicare coverage for innovative technologies based on clinical evidence with appropriate patient safeguards. Edwards is encouraged by CMS openness to incorporate robust, fit-for-purpose evidence development. However, the proposed guidance doesn't anticipate the TSET pathway will accept more than 5 candidates per year. Therefore, we urge CMS to establish specific criteria to select candidate technologies for TSET review. To support this, we also believe CMS should hire additional clinical and research experts from outside the agency. I urge Congress to work with CMS to improve and finalize the TSET guidance and consider additional legislative improvements. We must keep up the momentum, as further delay will prevent Medicare patients from timely access to life-saving breakthrough medical innovations. On behalf of Edwards Lifesciences, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your testimony. The chair will now recognize Ms. Wronski for 5 minutes for your opening statement.
Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today to share my story about my experience caring for my mother who lived with Alzheimer's disease for 11 years. My name is Sue Wronski. I'm from Potomac, Maryland, although I grew up in Syracuse, New York. I'm here today on behalf of my late mother, Lynn, who died from Alzheimer's in 2002, and my late father, Marty, who cared for her from the beginning of her devastating diagnosis until the very end. After several years of struggling with my mom's symptoms of early dementia, my parents finally received the unwelcome diagnosis of Alzheimer's in 1991 when she was just 63. She had what was called early or younger onset Alzheimer's. Back then, the diagnosis process was often longer than it is now, and she had been showing symptoms of the disease for a few years before finally diagnosed. Once it became clear that Mom would no longer be able to be at home on her own, my dad retired from his teaching job earlier than planned to be a full-time caregiver. In fact, our entire family became caregivers. Travel plans went by the wayside and long-planned projects were put on the back burner. Thankfully, she was able to be cared for at home for the 11 years that she lived with the disease. My dad was an incredible caregiver, and his Marine Corps training taught him that if you're given a problem, you play the hand that you're dealt. But he was also very willing to accept help when it was offered. It was tough on him, and yet he was such a supportive spokesperson for other caregivers. In addition to his full-time care of Mom, he became one of the Alzheimer's Association Central New York's chapter's most active advocates, and he eventually served on the board of directors there for several years. He wrote letters to the editor, he made visits to legislators, he took the bus to Albany with Mom in tow for the annual State Advocacy Day, and he joined me here in Washington one precious time for the Alzheimer's Impact Movement Advocacy Forum in 2006. He used to say, if the caregiver crashes, everything falls apart. And sure enough, 6 weeks after my mom passed away, my father was having triple bypass surgery because he had been ignoring his own heart issues. Caregivers will often put aside their own health issues to put loved ones first. Scientific progress has been momentous in the fight against Alzheimer's. In 1991, there were no treatments available to my mom. But in the last year and a half, we've seen 2 treatments be approved by the FDA. And even just this month, the FDA granted traditional approval for the first Alzheimer's treatment that changes the underlying cause of the disease. However, we as Alzheimer's advocates have had to raise our voices to ensure that Medicare covers these treatments. Under a 2022 policy by CMS, Alzheimer's drugs approved under the accelerated approval pathway were only available to individuals enrolled in randomized clinical trials. This translated into effectively no access throughout this period. Many people with Alzheimer's, some who I know very well, progressed even faster over this time than they might otherwise have because they were blocked from access to these treatments. Now that the first drug in this class has received traditional approval, access is becoming possible through a registry. And I appreciate that CMS seems to have worked hard to ensure that this registry now poses as little of a barrier as possible. Nevertheless, no such restrictions have ever been put in place for any other FDA-approved drug. With all of the evidence regarding these newer treatments, it is time for CMS to remove this policy. The benefits of these treatments will only be realized if patients have access. For those individuals who receive a diagnosis early, evidence released just this week indicates that the delay in progression of this disease could be 1 or more years. Still, patients are losing precious time. For individuals living with Alzheimer's, the value of time, while independent, is much different than those living with other chronic conditions. With Alzheimer's, it is all about time, and the last thing we need is more roadblocks. I'm an advocate to honor both of my parents, but especially to carry the torch for my father, who wanted nothing more than for a breakthrough to be found during his lifetime. This wasn't to be, as sadly we lost him in 2013. But I've got some time left on this earth, and I'd like nothing more during my lifetime than to witness the end to this horrible disease. Thank you so much for the opportunity to testify here today, and I look forward to answering any questions that the subcommittee might have.
Thank you for your powerful testimony. Sharing your parents' stories or stories is how it affects the policy, so thank you for doing that. So you're also blessed with 2 wonderful parents. That's one of life's great gifts. Yeah. Thank you. So it's tough to follow, Dr. Miller, but Dr. Miller, you're now recognized for 5 minutes for.
Chair Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and distinguished members of the Subcommittee on Health, thank you for allowing me to share my views on promoting access to innovation in the Medicare program. I'm a practicing hospitalist at Hopkins, a non-resident fellow at AAI. I have worked at 2 of those much maligned bureaucracies, FDA and CMS, and I actually also served on the CMS Medicare Evidence Development and Coverage Advisory Committee for 4 years. Today I'm here in my personal capacity. My views are my own and don't necessarily represent those of Hopkins, AEI, or the Medicare Payment Advisory Commission, of which I'm a commissioner. A few things I want to talk about today. One is innovation's a real thing. It's a real thing for individuals and populations. It's not an abstract. And so some numbers I pulled. Since 1950, FDA has approved over 1,200 new molecular entities. That's new drugs, completely new drugs. In 2022, last year, the FDA approved 22 pre-market approval applications for devices and this is a pretty big number, 3,194 510K clearances. Sort of nuts, right? And then we're like, well, new paradigms also emerge. There are 521 AI and machine learning enabled devices approved as of right now. What does this mean for actual individual patients? HIV, which was formerly a death sentence that disproportionately affected minority populations and LGBTQ plus populations, was a death sentence. Now the average lifespan after getting diagnosed is 40 years. That's partially because of the accelerated approval pathway. Healthcare labor productivity in hospitals is in the toilet. It's been flat for 20 years. Health tech and AI offer an opportunity for us to make delivery more efficient and more patient-centered. Thinking about Medicare's coverage policies really needs, and I'm glad we're doing this, it needs your time and attention. The agency has a variety of tools: local coverage decisions, national coverage decisions, coverage with evidence development. The problem is that the coverage function at CMS has ossified and decayed. It was actually Nancy Ann DeParle, who's the administrator under the Clinton administration, who recognized that and improved that starting in 1999. That effort was continued during the Bush administration. And then over the past 10 years, it's sort of decayed. I picked some numbers from before the pandemic, because I realized the pandemic's atypical. There were 2 national coverage decisions each in 2018 and 2019. So we definitely have work to do. MSET and TSET, they're both trying to do the same thing for devices. They ignore this overall broken system. Congress needs to update the statutory timelines for the coverage process and force CMS to issue guidance about when it uses which tools, and also update and provide guidance on what a definition of is for reasonable and necessary. You can't get coverage if you don't know what the standard is. It's hard to guess what the answer is. I think another thing to think about is that we need to improve medical device regulation to better support Medicare coverage. The FDA is drowning in 510K applications. It's over 2,800 annually, and actually during the pandemic, 2 reviewers committed suicide due to the diagnostic review burden, and they were overworking 18 hours a day and at home and isolated. So we need to tune up and support the third-party review program for 510K applications so that we can offload this burden from the FDA and let the FDA figure out how to best address high-risk applications. They're just not going to be able to hire another 1,000 doctors and biomedical engineers. We'd like to think they can. It's probably not realistic. We also need fit-for-purpose pathways that are voluntary and alternative pathways for health tech and AI. We're in a software-driven world. The FDA's regulatory process for devices is from the disco ball era. The other thing which I wanted to mention is that we definitely should not be a stick in the mud when we think about paying for health tech and AI. We did that with telehealth, and now we're catching up after decades. We shouldn't be doing the same thing for technology. We shouldn't be worried about the precautionary principle. AI is one of the few things that can make medical care safer, more efficient, more effective, and easier for patients to access, and it's going to help the disadvantaged populations in Medicare the most. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. That concludes our witnesses' opening statements. We appreciate that. We will now begin the questioning, and I will recognize myself for 5 minutes for questions. So, Dr. Brinton, how long has it taken for your technology to get a coverage decision? I'm sorry, Dr. Brinton, yeah. How long has it taken your?
So we're speaking specifically about TAVR. It was a working relationship between the coverage decision that was between FDA approval that happened in 2011 and actually pretty quick as a requirement, and it was structured with CED. So it was a working relationship. It was really all the groups coming together between FDA, CMS, the medical communities, and patient advocacy groups that ultimately drafted what we felt was the best at the time, the data we had, the best approach to actually move forward with the technology. A life-saving disruptive technology was going to have pretty dramatic effects on patients' lives. We've seen now actually, really as a result of the TBT registry and as required by CED, that we've learned from that. And there's been some confusion about this. The fact that the CED requirement, the TBT, has provided a real knowledge and understanding about inequities in care that we're now aware of, that we were really unintended consequence of really the structure that we built. So we move very rapidly to get that approval, but we're learning. And I think earlier in my testimony, I identified the fact that there's big differences between drugs and devices.
Right.
Devices really require procedure. They're a component of an entire therapy for patients. And so it's important to recognize that they're different than the drugs themselves. So they retire, and the learning needs to go on. This gap we talk about, the valley of death, we often identified as the valley of death for the company, is really in some ways the valley of death for patients, because we're getting FDA approval, we're getting something that's safe and effective, but we're not necessarily getting to the possibility of providing this therapy broadly for patients in a meaningful way.
Okay,
So
thank you.
really, the proposal today is to provide that opportunity in the gap.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate your answer. Dr. Aklog, in Dr. Miller's testimony, he notes there were 166 devices we just heard that received breakthrough designation in 2022 alone. In the TSET proposed rule, CMS indicates they could only accept 5 applicants for the TSET coverage pathway. Could you speak to how this would impact a company's decision to pursue that pathway?
Yeah, as I said, it just won't work. I mean, just to be really blunt, it has a variety of problems. I think the lottery analogy is a bit, at least from a small company point of view, is a bit apt. First of all, it assumes that that progress is linear, that every year we'll have 5 applications and it sort of moves on at a steady pace. That's not the case. There may be some years where there's a flow of innovations and others where it's slow. So to allocate 5 a year is just not enough. 5 itself doesn't sound anywhere close to being a sufficient number. And we suspect, and I think there's hinting that that's related to questions around resources. I also hinted at inequities. If there are only 5 and it's a lottery, and CMS provides some hint as to how they will select those 5, at the end of the day, that's sort of pitting one patient group against the other. And if it's based on the size of the populations, then rare diseases and devices that target smaller populations will be left out. It just can't work. I mean, it's the analogy. Another analogy I would take is the FDA. Honestly, it'd be the equivalent of the FDA saying, okay, this year we can only do 100 510Ks and we can do X number of PMAs, and sorry, you didn't make the cut this year, then you have to wait till next year. It really is equivalent to that, and it just can't work.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your testimony. And Dr. Miller, as we talked about accelerated approval drugs and high-cost medications with potential to cure a life-threatening or otherwise debilitating condition, how important will it be for CMS to leverage value-based contracting? And what do you believe Congress should do to promote value-based contracting?
Thank you. One is pass the MVP Act, I would say, as number one. And then number 2 is look at the Medicaid drug rebate program and potentially look at creating a statutory exception for value-based arrangements tied to clinical outcomes over time. Because right now, the Medicare program can't do that, because if you have clinical outcomes that are priced, say, $0, $100,000, $200,000 at 6 months, and different values at 12 and 18 months, if you get $0 for that outcome, that means the best priced is $0. We need to fix that to allow for the Medicaid program to pay for value, and we should be doing the same in the Medicare program.
Thank you. And then, Dr. Brinton, the same kind of question I asked Dr. Aklog. From your perspective as a larger device manufacturer, can you talk about how the TSET proposal will affect breakthrough device pathway?
Yeah, so I think the TSET pathway is a positive step. One of the things that was brought up is really an arbitrary number of 5 potential TSETs per year, suggesting it's linear and the resources. It depends, and I think there needs to be prioritization, deciding on what should actually be approached first. So life-saving technologies, really significant impact technologies, unmet clinical needs, and technologies that actually satisfy disparities. Those should be the prioritization as it comes to approaching which things go first when there's these resource limitations.
Okay, thank you. Well, my time is, appreciate your answers, all of you. My time has expired, and I now recognize the ranking member SU, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank each one of the witnesses. You've given really superb testimony to us this morning, and it's varied, but it speaks to all the different moving parts, the parts that aren't moving quickly enough, and then what the impacts are when the parts don't move very well. I wish I had time to spend with each one of you, but we have 5 minutes for everyone. And but your wealth of knowledge and experience, I think, is really enhanced and deepened, broadened our understanding of what's at hand. I have the privilege of representing the Silicon Valley district in our country. So the word innovation drives us every split second of the day. It is, I think, the innovation capital of our country, and we want to keep it that way. To Dr. Brinton, thank you for your work at Stanford Byers Center for Biodesign. Brooke Byers is a, America is blessed by his leadership and his knowledge and the work that he has done, and you're a very important part of that. In your testimony, you spoke about your company's experience with CED to cover TAVR, the TAVR device, and how you view it as a success story. We all view it as a success story. It's exciting to hear you describe it. From others on the panel, we heard your concerns about the potential barriers to coverage a CED might present. Now, based on your experience with a CED, what do you think was in the success lane? What do you think should be done differently?
Ranking Member Eshoo, Ranking Member Eshoo, thank you very much for your question. I think it's really clear that we need a predictable process. That does not mean certainty of outcome. It means a predictable process. So we can all understand the risk versus benefit of going down this process of innovation.
Well, the individuals, the innovators, they're the risk takers, so they understand risk.
Yeah, but actually coming up with also timelines that are quite clear, anything that does that improves patient care. It provides the benefit. Every day we wait is the potential that a patient dies because they haven't gotten to therapy that has been found to be safe and effective for patients. But in addition to that, when it comes to CED specifically, there's been big benefits of things we've learned. I mentioned earlier about disparities of care. However, there's also the concern over least burdensome. And right now we know that actually the TBT registry, although it provides real benefit, is quite burdensome on the providers. It actually is an 8-page report that often they need to complete of data to collect, when often takes longer than the TAVR procedure itself.
Wow.
And so that does not meet the criteria. We want to learn from continuous evidence, but this burden seems to be too much. But taking it a step further, it allows us to also think about the fact of what really is the limiting factor, and currently it's the NCD. The NCD is the limiting factor that chooses the number of sites and the operator's resources and training that needs to be done. And if we're going to address this, we need to actually address the NCD directly.
Okay, thank you. Ms. Wronski, you're a magnificent daughter, really a magnificent daughter, and thank you. Your testimony has touched everyone here. Dr. Aklog, you have such a powerful story, and America is blessed by you. See what immigrants do for our country, really. So thank you for that. You have such an inspiring life story of being a first-generation American, and it's always exciting for me to hear the stories. Reminds me of my own family's story. I'm a first-generation American, and you're now an entrepreneur. You've invented advanced diagnostic technologies that, as you spoke, saving lives. The CMS new rule on transitional coverage for emerging technologies excluded diagnostics for the new coverage pathway. Can you just speak briefly, I don't have very much time left, that this decision would have on patient access and innovation?
Sure. Thank you for your kind comments, Congresswoman. Surgeons are pretty blunt. That's all I'm known to be blunt, so I'll be blunt again. There's just no justification for excluding diagnostics as part of this process.
He's sitting next to me.
I know.
That's why we're laughing.
I've got one that's here, too. A lot of the most cutting edge, we saw COVID. We see this revolution in cancer care, from screening to precision medicine to minimal residual disease and others. And these breakthroughs are staggering. So the need for this process to be predictable and transparent is as great with diagnostics than elsewhere. And the MAC-led process that controls coverage right now, and therefore access to these innovative diagnostics, is complicated. It's sort of Byzantine. It's not transparent. It's not predictable. You have to deal with multiple different local coverage MACs with regard to their local coverage determinations that may not be where your laboratory is, and so forth. So it needs to be upgraded, and I'm looking forward to progress on the legislation as well as improvements for TISA.
Good. Thank you. I've gone over my time, and so I don't have any time to yield back. Thank you for your patience.
Generally yields. Now recognize the chairwoman of the full committee, Ms. Rogers, for her 5 minutes.
Dr. Rost, I was alarmed by the proposed Alzheimer's NCD's categorical exclusion of patients with Down syndrome from any form of coverage. Yet, despite CMS's removal of this blanket exclusion, patients with Down syndrome will continue to have extreme difficulty practically accessing these approved treatments. What are neurologists and other doctors doing to help CMS swiftly recover its policy so that patients can more broadly access these treatments and that patients with Down syndrome, in coordination with their other doctors, can develop more specialized ways to access these treatments?
Thank you, Chairwoman, for asking this question. This is very important to us as neurologists and to the entire field of neuroscience professionals. As you know, we are very strong advocates for inclusive care. We want to make sure that the competent care is delivered to every American in need, and we've been engaging with the CMS specifically and also other agencies and continue the advocacy on the Hill to make sure that we have processes in place that allow not only to gain access to appropriate care for those patients who fit the inclusion criteria of the original trials that bring the peer-reviewed evidence to us, but also create the opportunities for those criteria to be reviewed in a nimble and effective way, and also have an opportunity for this two-pronged approach where off-ramp is offered to patients as they gain the level of evidence for efficacy and safety for them to be able to access the medications that they need.
Yes, for those with Down syndrome, you know, it wasn't that long ago, their life expectancy was maybe 20 years, and now they're living longer, 60 years, as we give them a chance for life. I wanted, as a follow-up, but they're developing Alzheimer's, so it just makes sense that they would be included, that we could learn from those with Down syndrome and others. So even the most streamlined coverage with evidence development policy involves some extra burden on physicians, patients, and even caregivers. Dr. Rost, is there clear guidance or consistency from CMS at which point they will end CED and transition to traditional coverage?
At this time, there are certain processes that have been already put in place. For example, there is a 24-month a period of observation and data gathering that CMS put in place. But we are not entirely clear yet what the process will entail, and we continue to seek more transparency in that space.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Aklog and Dr. Brinton, Congress and the public currently have no insight into the request pending before CMS for national coverage determinations. I recently led a letter with my colleagues on this topic, and I'm also concerned about the lack of dedicated coverage pathway for truly innovative medical products and the lack of commitment to predictable timelines in the process in the TSET proposed notice. So I have a couple of questions for each of you, and limited time. So quickly, please. Would greater transparency into the coverage process overall and NCD requests in particular help you with your company's planning and ability to ultimately deliver these innovations to patients, and what specific information is helpful?
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Absolutely. I think I counted transparency and predictability in my opening remarks where I mentioned it a dozen times or so, and they're critical and they go hand in hand. Without them, particularly as a small company, we're basically flying blind. It's hard to plan, it's hard to operate, it's hard to raise capital. It's really hard to know where we're going without transparency, having some level of communication. With commercial payers, we have ad board meetings, we talk to medical directors, we have peer-to-peers during claims adjudication. There's an ongoing back and forth as to how, what we need to do to cross certain thresholds. Okay. With FDA, we do the same, pre-sub meetings and so forth, and we need both. We really do need transparency.
Thank you. I'm gonna add on to this question before you get to answer, Dr. Brinton. Would you also mention one or two of the most important targeted policies or concepts that we need to maintain from the previous Medicare coverage of innovation technology rule and bipartisan introduced legislation not included in the TSET proposed notice?
Yeah, I think it's timely coverage. I mean, earlier there was obviously immediate coverage within MSET, and TSET currently has a 6-month review. I think trying to pull that earlier as possible is benefit to patients. As I mentioned, every day that goes by, we're not providing, evidence-based technologies that have been proven safe and effective for patients. So pulling that earlier is clearly going to be a big benefit to patients overall. The other thing is that TSET, I think, serves an opportunity as a setup to the NCD. I mentioned medical devices are different. The burden is different, reasonable and necessary, and so providing the opportunity for evidence to then meet that criteria prevents a gap, in a sense, to meet the need of what the requirements are for medical devices.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I've run out of time. I yield back.
Gentlelady yields back. Recognize Mr. Sarbanes for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thanks to all of you. Obviously, much interest in this hearing today, and your testimony has been extremely helpful. Just want to kind of restate some of the basic principles that we've recognized today. First, that seniors deserve timely access to safe and effective treatments and medical technologies, especially, obviously, those with the most promise for generating real, meaningful improvement in health outcomes, which is what we're always striving for. But we also know that they and their doctors deserve a clear understanding of the risks and benefits of innovative therapies so they can make the best informed decisions about treatment options. We've talked about how the current process can take up to 5 years for breakthrough devices to gain nationwide Medicare coverage, and we've talked about the proposed transitional coverage for emerging technologies and the notice that's gone out on this, which would provide a pathway for expedited coverage of emerging devices with the goal, obviously, of increasing the breakthrough device availability for Medicare beneficiaries. Dr. Brinton, I wanted to focus a little bit on the clinical trials dimension of this. Typically, clinical trials for emerging therapies tend to be small, may not always be reflective of the broader Medicare population. Could you discuss what types of evidence gaps can exist and how this transitional coverage pathway, and I gather its collection of, or proposed collection of real-world data, can help address them and support Medicare coverage of breakthrough devices?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question, Representative. I think it's important to recognize that breakthrough technologies, that qualification is really a first-in-line review. It's not a difference of the quality or the review process. It's actually just moves it to the earlier place in the line to be reviewed more rapidly. And so with that, I think that safety and effectiveness is not in question. The opportunity to potentially provide these therapies for patients early in the process is the opportunity to ultimately make big impact in patients' lives. And so the therapies that we can potentially provide earlier in the process and the things that we can do to actually impact those patients are going to have positive impact on outcomes. Innovation potentially is the solution here. It's not the problem. It's an opportunity to kind of turn this over and actually suggest that it's a bracelet to drive benefit. So we think of TAVR therapy, which I mentioned in my statement. TAVR therapy is the triple win. It's the provision of actually improve mortality, improve quality of life, and actually reduce costs. And if we compare it to some of the other predicates that are out there, it provides the benefit of ultimately really, truly reducing costs and driving value, as well as delivering great care for patients.
Talk to me a little bit more, though, about what this concept of collecting real-world data means in the context of the clinical trial approach.
So I think that the fit-for-purpose component of TSETs has been suggested provides the flexibility of not one-size-fits-all. In a sense, it depends on the technology, depends on the patient population. And so the idea of being able to use claims data potentially to actually have real-world data actually make decisions versus some require a full registry, a detailed registry, and that depends on the technology that's at hand. So I think evidence is the key, particularly as I mentioned with the medical devices. We learn from the evidence. We change our device, our ability, our skills change over time. The procedures change over time. So we need to collect that data to make decisions about how to optimize and iterate our technologies. So I think that it'll be a range of possibilities. I think fit for purpose needs to be better defined within TSET, but it provides the flexibility because it could be claims data, but it could be registry data as well.
Okay, that's helpful. Dr. MacGillivray, in your testimony, you discussed the importance of collecting robust evidence to inform coverage decisions. Can you explain a little bit more why that's so critical? And it seems intuitively obvious, but why that can help inform coverage decisions and why, again, it's important to collect real-world evidence when we can do that for new and innovative medical devices?
Yes, thank you, Congressman, for the question. As mentioned earlier, clinical trials are designed to answer specific questions. if you have confounding problems, it can confound your answer. So carefully selected patients at carefully selected institutions, which usually are small patient populations that don't have other risk factors, are chosen. But even though those narrow inclusion criteria, the application, the approval is broad for patients with those problems. An example that we learned from our data registry on monitoring artificial heart technology, left ventricular assist devices. There are 2 devices on the market based on clinical trials that showed that they were equivalent. Unfortunately, what we saw from our data was that one of the devices, over time, had more incidence of stroke and death compared to the other device. Identifying that from that database, we were able to notify the FDA, and that device has been taken off the market. So even though they were equivalent in clinical trials, the registry showed they were different.
Thanks very much. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Dr. Burgess, 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. Dr. Rost, in part of your answer to Chairwoman McMorris-Rogers' question, can you give us any idea as to whether Right to Try, which this committee passed a little over 5 years ago, has Right to Try impacted the ability of a patient to access a therapy?
Yes, this is a great question because this was the nature of our resubmission, a request for reconsideration to CMS with regard to the national coverage determination for this patient population. Basically, we are concerned that the increasing burden of real-world data collection over the time of administration of the drug for each individual patient will increase the burden on neurological practices that are already experiencing the burdens of taking care of growing number of neurologic patients with multiple diagnoses, not only patients who suffer from Alzheimer's dementia. And so even though we appreciate CMS taking concrete steps to simplify the web-based portal that they're proposing as part of the CED pathway, we still feel that there is a risk of increasing burden and through that decreasing access to treatment.
Sure. Dr. Miller, thank you so much for joining us today. It's always insightful when we get to hear you speak. Can you speak to the current regulatory challenges for FDA and CMS that exist for artificial intelligence in digital health?
Thank you. I'm not sure we have enough time to go through all of them. There's quite a long list. CMS is not prepared to pay for new health technology and AI. You could ask the sort of snarky but appropriate question of, should a tech company be a Part B provider, as an example? We don't have a way of paying for automated service. We don't have a way of paying for augmented, human-driven service. We don't have appropriate FDA regulatory tools for that. Like the FDA has done a great job with the tools it has the predetermined change control guidance, which allows sort of a range of improvements to happen to a device, but the FDA doesn't want to review version 5.2.2 and version 5.2.3 of software. So we really need to give the FDA fit-for-purpose, building block-driven regulatory pathways for medical software, and then we need to tie that to coverage.
So you anticipated one of my next questions. Is CMS prepared to classify and reimburse for artificial intelligence?
Unfortunately not.
And, I mean, this is not just an academic question. I've had visits from radiologists who legitimately have concerns about where they see their profession going and yes, how reimbursement will happen from that. I mean, many of us remember the experiences of 20, 25 years ago when insurance companies began to incorporate some black box edits into their insurance payments. And in fact, it took a class action suit on the part of many state medical associations to get them to stop doing this. But on the other hand, with the advent of AI, it seems like, well, again, without the proper guardrails and controls, it may not work out well.
Right, and I would add that the difference for regulating AI for regulating other sort of medical devices is it's more regulated on performance. The details of the black box matter, but it's like the traction control on your car. We know it's there, we know it works. I don't know the details of how it works, but the regulator does. But that the end user needs to know that it performs as expected.
Let me just ask, time I've got left, a couple of questions on CMMI. I've been frustrated that CMMI was created, it was created as an offset for costs in the Affordable Care Act, and yet our chairman of the Oversight Committee is here. We never get any data back from CMMI as to what the models that they've entertained, what they actually save, what the deliverable from CMMI is. So do any of you have any thoughts or input on that and direction that you can give the chairman of Oversight and Investigation? Well, knowing Dr. Brinton, you're bound to have some idea.
I was going to say that the problem with CMMI is that it usurps Congress's authority. So it's making payment policy decisions and I worked at CMMI, it's making decisions outside the purview of the public and potentially mandating it out to an entire industry, be it physicians, hospitals, device companies, pharmaceutical product manufacturers. So there's, it's something that should be put back into the hands of Congress.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more, Mr. Chairman. I hope you took that into consideration. Now yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Now recognize Mr. Cardenas for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Guthrie and Ranking Member Eshoo, for holding this hearing to discuss access to innovative treatment therapies. I also want to thank our witnesses for joining us today and sharing their perspectives on existing pathways to bring life-saving devices, drugs, and technologies to market. For much of my time in Congress, I've advocated for and supported the idea of transitional coverage for breakthrough devices. This Congress, I'm proud to co-lead the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthrough Products Act, along with my colleagues Representative Del Bene, Wenstrup, Moore, Sewell, and my Energy and Commerce Committee colleagues Chairman Guthrie, Ranking Member Eshoo, and Representative Bilirakis. This bill would allow designated medical breakthrough devices that are approved through the FDA Breakthrough Devices Program to be temporarily covered under Medicare during a 4-year transitional period. So my question to Dr. Brinton is, Dr. Brinton, you note in your testimony that a, quote, a well-designed transitional coverage program could allow Medicare beneficiaries access to cutting-edge medical innovation while ensuring that those innovations are used appropriately. What kind of impact do you expect something like this would have on patient access and patient care?
Thank you very much for your question. I think along with TSET, obviously this group, Congress weighing in on TSET, has an important role to play in impacting the possibility of actually creating and filling the gap I mentioned earlier, this gap between approval and, as had been researched by Stanford, the greater than 5 years it takes to get actual meaningful coverage to Medicare recipients for breakthrough technologies. As you speak directly about legislation, I think any effort we can make to actually align the possibility as of bringing resources to recognize the fact of this important initiative for innovation for Medicare recipients is positive. This is an important component of which drives our innovation engine, which actually improves health of the entire American population. So either of these, whether it's legislative or weighing in on obviously the TSET rule, is beneficial.
Okay, and how can we ensure that this type of access is enjoyed equitably?
Absolutely, it's a huge priority for this to be equitable, and I think that the way to establish that is data, right? We need to understand it. I mentioned earlier when we actually drew up the first NCD and worked with CMS and FDA, we had best of intentions to actually, as I mentioned, for safe and appropriate care, but we've learned. We had unintentional consequences in the sense that we don't have equal access to care. We know that now from the TVT registry, and that allows us to build strategies to address this directly. So by building these strategies, we can actually work with, and we can actually approach the NCD. The NCD, in a sense, that limits resources to certain rural areas that don't have the same resources and capabilities, to operator training, which is a major component of the ability to actually do enough cases, in a sense. We know that the complication rate is extremely low for TAVR, for instance, and so getting access for these technologies as well. But there's also the grassroots effort. So the National Urban League, working with the Association of Black Cardiologists, and actually in the community, making sure we recognize the access that they need to have, that promote the fact that this life-saving therapy is available to Medicare recipients.
Thank you. I also want to revisit an issue I raised in 2019 relating to racial disparities in access to transcatheter aortic valve replacement, otherwise known as TAVR, a treatment for aortic stenosis. As you mentioned in your testimony, CMS released a coverage decision that invoked the, quote, coverage with evidence of development, or CED, pathway to allow you to collect necessary data aligned with the FDA post-market requirements. Dr. Brinton, in your testimony, you note it is because of data collection through the CED requirements that you were able to identify disparities in patient access to TAVR. How can the TAVR registry help ensure access to treatment for all patient populations?
I think it's much the same. That the trade-off is the burdensome component of it. And so we've learned a lot from the TVT registry as mandated by CED. But the burdensome, as I mentioned, the fact that it's an 8-page report that takes longer than the procedure itself, that's burdensome on the physicians, the care providers. So we need to find the balance between collecting appropriate information that's going to help us make best decisions. And as we expand therapy, we're going to learn more. As we expand therapy, it's important we continue to get data to make good decisions about access so that we understand how these technologies are being provided and actually trying to actually have, to improve the inequities of access to care.
What other lessons can we learn from the TAVR registry?
I think we've learned a lot. We use the TVT registry for us to understand how to improve our innovative process. We understand how we work side by side with physicians, and we have patient advocacy. We work with patient groups to actually understand their experiences, actually, and what's going on with the procedure itself. But particularly, it's how we innovate the next generation of devices. We learn where the limitations are, and we actually seek to improve upon them.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My time having expired, I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Latta for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thanks for holding today's hearing, and thanks to all of our witnesses for being with us today. Earlier this month, CMS finalized its maximum fair price MFP guidance that unfortunately failed to ensure a drug price negotiation framework that provides incentives for innovation. This could have been achieved if CMS had established the MFP at the ceiling price for products that are therapeutic advancements or that address unmet medical needs. In doing so, the agency could have ensured that incentives deployed during the drug price negotiations are clearly defined and achievable. This system does not preserve incentives for investment into rare diseases. A long fear that coverage and innovation would be stifled in the aftermath of the Inflation Reduction Act's passage into law. We're now seeing the consequences of this when it comes to Alzheimer's coverage and investments. The IRA and the CMS and National Coverage Determination for Alzheimer's treatments disproportionately restricts patient access to new treatments in high-need areas. In contrast, Medicare has always covered FDA-approved drugs for those living with other conditions like cancer, heart disease, and HIV until now. The implications from the drug price control program and reducing investment in treatments for Alzheimer's disease alone could be deeply impactful for patients and their caregivers, especially given the inherent suffering associated with the disease and the costs to the U.S. health system that total more than $1 trillion per year. Early indications suggest that U.S. biopharma industry will need to cut back on R&D into treatments due to these controls. If I could ask Ms. Wronski, am I pronouncing your name properly?
Wronski.
Okay, I'm sorry.
It was pretty close.
But first, thank you for your testimony. In my family, on both sides, we've had devastating effects because of Alzheimer's and dementia. And we also know, as what you in your testimony pointed out, for caregivers and what's out there. And it's something that is affecting more and more families across our nation. And it's something that we need to be looking at. Because again, this is an absolutely horrible disease, and it's one that we need, as I mentioned, that how much, just not only in human costs, but in dollars that is spent, and we need to find a cure. With CMS' decision to restrict Alzheimer's patients' access to treatments through the agency's unprecedented NSC decision, how might this impact America's seniors And not only just seniors, there's also younger people that are getting Alzheimer's that I know, and their confidence in public health officials, given their hopes of witnessing the next generation of promising Alzheimer's treatments.
Very good question, and thank you for the question, Representative Lada. So I can tell you two words that in the senior committee and in the Alzheimer's community, and you're right, more and more younger people are experiencing Alzheimer's disease now. Hope and frustration. Back what I said in my testimony, when my mother was diagnosed, there really was no hope for any kind of treatment for her. And for many years in my advocacy work, I've been saying that should I be diagnosed with Alzheimer's tomorrow, I'm not much younger than my mom was when she was diagnosed at 61. I turned 60 myself this year. There would have been no better treatment for me than there was for my mother 30 years ago. That's all changed now. We're in the era of treatment now for Alzheimer's, and the hope is, it's been very exciting for us the last couple of years. I can say that without doubt. But to have gotten this far, I've been advocating since 2004. And I've gotten to meet more and more people living in the early stages of Alzheimer's disease. People are fortunately getting diagnosed a little bit more quickly these days. But to find out that there are treatments available, FDA-approved treatments available, and they are not able to access those treatments has been incredibly frustrating. We are very happy now that the company has received traditional approval, that CMS has agreed to cover it. The registries, however, I'm completely in favor of acquiring more information. I think it's an important tool in the process of living and dealing with Alzheimer's disease. We do see it as another roadblock for those doctors who are not enrolled in registries, who are not utilizing registries for location or other reasons they might not be in it. A patient wouldn't have access to the registries. Many roadblocks we feel have been put up to these new drugs, and there's a lot of frustration in the Alzheimer's community due to that.
Well, thank you very much for your advocacy, and again, for all those across this country that are suffering from that absolutely horrible disease of Alzheimer's, that appreciate all that you're doing in your work. Mr. Chairman, my time has expired, and I'll submit my other questions after the hearing. But thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back, and the chair recognizes the ranking member, Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have some questions, but I have to first take a few moments to respond to the claims from my Republican colleagues about the Inflation Reduction Act, which for the first time empowers the Secretary of Health and Human Services to negotiate on behalf of Medicare to lower drug costs for America's seniors. The law caps out-of-pocket costs at $2,000 annually for Medicare Part D, caps insulin at $35 a month in Medicare, and stops drug companies from unfairly raising their prices faster than the rate of inflation. And these are all wins for the American people, in my opinion. And Republicans would have you believe that we must make a choice between reducing drug prices and bringing new and innovative drugs to market. But that's not true. I think these are scare taxes, and I'm just kind of tired of these old talking points on the other side that put forward also by the pharmaceutical industry, who are only interested in remaining one of the most profitable industries in the world. I think Republicans are saying they're protecting innovation, but they're at the same time pushing these multi-billion-dollar appropriation cuts to research at NIH, ARPA-H, and other HHS-funded programs. So, I believe the Democrats have delivered on lowering drug prices. We're going to continue to push to ensure that more Americans can take advantage of these savings from the Inflation Reduction Act by extending the negotiated prices to those outside of Medicare as well. And we're going to continue to push for funding for research. There's no reason, as I said earlier in my opening statement, why this can't all go hand in hand. We need our federal agencies. We need to take action to help people to deal with affordability. But at the same time, we can have innovation with the drug companies and innovation through our federal research arms as well. There's no reason why these can't all happen at the same time. Now, let me just say, I just wanted to ask a question. I wanted to mention clinical trials. I have to cut back on it because I only have 3 minutes here. But I think that clinical trials may not always reflect the diversity of the patient population, and this is particularly true of Medicare beneficiaries who can be underrepresented in clinical trials. And I also understand there's evidence gaps in specific patient populations not included in the clinical trial, and important questions remaining on drug side effects. But let me just ask Dr. MacGillivray, can you briefly explain how the evidence development requirements on transcatheter aortic valve replacement, TAVR, helped expand access to previously undertreated patients? Briefly.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman. So in the early trials of TAVR, involved 25 centers and about 700 patients. We now, through the TVT registry, have 830 centers of the total 1,100 cardiac surgery programs in the country. We have 700,000 patients now involved in the TVT registry. There's a TAVR registry, there's a TAVR center in every state in the United States now. And in major metropolitan centers around the country, there are multiple TAVR centers. So in the beginning, it was limited access to selected patients. It's not perfect now, but it is much better.
Well, I appreciate that. I'm glad to see these additional patient groups have gained access to this therapy thanks to the evidence generated by the TVT registry. But let me ask Dr. Rost. I understand that AAN has proposed a two-prong coverage for lecanemab. Can you briefly explain why it's important to collect real-world evidence for specific patient groups?
Thank you for this question. We did propose a two-prong approach, one prong being the allowing patients who meet the criteria that have been fully supported through evidence to be meaningfully both clinical and statistical to be excused, so to speak, or excluded from the CED criteria. We also suggested an off-ramp for those patients who have been included into the ongoing study to have a transparent and also clear process by which they would be able to exit that particular pathway. But the real-world evidence could be very important. We could learn not only about the particular medication, in this case lecanemab, but there's also an upcoming pipeline of medical innovations that we're going to continue to learn how they apply to the real-world scenarios and patients that may both benefit from the efficacy of those drugs and also will learn with regard to the safety profile.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Griffith of Virginia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I greatly appreciate it. As far as old talking points go, the reason that we have old talking points is that my colleagues on the other side of the aisle aren't listening. The negotiations that take place with the drug manufacturers that were included in the IRA and originally in H.R. 3 are such that the government comes in, they tell you we're going to negotiate. You can't talk about it if you're a drug manufacturer. And if you don't agree to the price that we're going to offer you, we're going to take 95% of your sales. That's not much of a negotiation unless you're the godfather. Exclusivity is also a problem in the IRA because of the fact that particularly with small molecule treatments, the exclusivity period is so short that companies have told me they may take their trials overseas and medicine may not be available as quickly in the United States. All right, that's it. Back to my questioning. I understand that Dr. Brinton, I understand that nearly a third of all products requiring coverage with evidence development since 2005 were for cardiovascular medical products. Furthermore, I understand that registry costs in the case of the transcatheter valve therapy registry are roughly $25,000. And as you've said, you've talked about it as being burdensome, and the staff hours and resources are a real challenge for both providers and their patients, especially in rural areas. So what do we do about the rural areas? How are the registries set up funding-wise? Does the industry help rural areas get started? Is there a process to help the startup?
So thank you very much, Congressman Griffin, for the question. This is obviously a major focus for us now, particularly with the fact that we've learned from the TVT registry that we do have inequities in care, particularly in rural areas. So we are making great efforts. I think, as I mentioned earlier, I think one of the drivers of this is actually the limitations that come as resource limitations within the NCD. So the NCD has listed a number of sites that can be involved in TAVR. That's not necessarily have anything to do with CED. We're learning the information from CED that tells us about the inequities in care. So we're trying to then develop strategies to address those. And one of those is the limitations that are provided, as I mentioned, from the NCD. So there are resources. The resources generally come from the guidance of the NCD. So that's one area that I think we can potentially suggest that we need to actually approach. Other areas are the fact that we need really grassroots effort to actually get those patients that are, racial disparities actually addressed directly. It's not just inequities in care in rural, but it's also we have within the inner cities, we actually have racial disparities as well. And we're learning that through the actual CED and the TBT registry directly. So how do we do that? We need a strategy. And the strategy is that we need to think about, even if you're in a large city, and people suggest that, as I mentioned earlier, we have TAVR centers in all states, and at the time that we came up with this strategy, we were really trying to roll out, as I mentioned, the safe and most appropriate way to bring this life-saving therapy to patients. But that was at the time. We've learned now from that. And the action is, can we bring access to more patients? That means bringing in those technologies into the rural communities directly. And right now, whether you're in the rural communities or in the inner city, sometimes it takes jumping on a bus for multiple hours to actually get to something that's 12 miles away. And so that's impossible for access for some actual providers and for some patients. And so we need to think about the fact that we've actually distributed these centers in a way that doesn't necessarily provide equal access. And so that's now what the TBT registry has provided us. And so then once we have the ability to open further centers, we then have the ability to actually provide this care to the rural areas themselves.
Yeah, I am concerned because Alzheimer's affects us all, and I'm just wondering, are we doing enough in the rural areas? And I'm not against talking about the inner cities as well, and I understand it may take a while because sometimes we have a problem with people look at a map and they say, in my district, they say, well, it looks like it's only this far apart. What they don't know is there's two mountains in the way, and what might take, if you were just driving the mileage at 65 miles an hour, it might only take you 15 minutes, but to get around the mountain, you're not going 65 miles an hour. So I recognize your bus analogy, but I'm really concerned about the rural areas that people are not being served, and I'm particularly concerned with comments that Ms. Wronski brought up that that they're not being served. Ms. Wronski, what do you think? What do we need to do in the rural areas?
That's a great question.
Should we get rid of the registry for the people who are trying to do it in those rural areas or where they're underserved, whether it be inner city or rural? I mean, I know the registry can help, but can it prohibit health?
I think it can. I think it can be prohibitive. Absolutely. We do have a lot of issues with outreach in some rural states where we only have one Alzheimer's chapter for resources alone. Those are areas that aren't being touched by things like this. So it can be prohibitive. Again, very much in favor of continuing the process of learning more about these drugs. But I think where a patient has proven that they have the disease and they are in need of treatment and the treatments are available, we believe that they should have access to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, as you know, but maybe the folks back home or around the country and maybe their witnesses don't know, my district landmass is larger than 9 states. I'm east of the Mississippi. I'm one of the largest, if not the largest, east of the Mississippi, and I have a lot of rural people who don't get health care. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Custer for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for testifying today. I want to thank you, Ms. Wronski, for sharing your experience as a daughter of someone with Alzheimer's. My heart definitely goes out to you. My own mother, former state senator Susan McLean, was in the public eye in New Hampshire when she was diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And we worked through her disease progression together, ending up co-writing a book about her experience called The Last Dance. I appreciate you being here today to help educate us and the public on this important topic. So thank you for sharing your story. Today's hearing is an opportunity to understand how Medicare serves as a conduit for innovation, not only through the millions of beneficiaries, but for the broader healthcare system. I'm working with several colleagues on this committee to advance legislation that promotes program innovation, including my bipartisan bill with Representative Miller Meeks that would increase access to generics and biosimilar drugs for people with Medicare coverage. We need to prioritize policies that promote innovation and improve access to health care across the board. I'm going to turn to Dr. Miller. Your testimony references the need to think differently about paying for health technology, including telehealth. I'm a strong advocate of telehealth services, particularly in helping to reach Medicare beneficiaries in rural areas. We brought ourselves some time with the extension through 2024, but important conversations remain and the clock is ticking. Can you briefly explain your recommendations on how to improve the payment system for telehealth and other considerations as this committee weighs the future of telehealth policies before the end of 2024?
Thank you. An excellent question. It actually helps the inner-city beneficiaries who have 4 buses to get to the doctor. It also helps the rural beneficiary who has to drive around 2 mountains in a blizzard, right? Because you can access care either, you know,
And the
from
busy working parent who doesn't have
Who doesn't have
access
time.
to, or
Yeah.
time to childcare, grandparents taking care of kids now.
Exactly. I mean, not everyone has half a day to take off or an entire day to go take off and go to the doctor's office. I think, well, one is this payment parity for telehealth versus in-person is just not realistic. I know everyone, like lots of advocacy groups want that, but it's just not realistic. It doesn't cost as much money. A way to think about it is you could think about tiers of service, right? You could think about in-person human-driven service. You could think about some degree of automated service. You could think about human capital-driven, like physician-driven remote service, audiovisual, with, say, a Bluetooth-assisted remote exam. You could think about remote telehealth without the exam. You could think about audio only. You could think about text message-based or SMS text messaging, patient portal, and you could attach a modifier, and you could have that modifier have different values between 0 and 1 for, say, everywhere on the physician fee schedule, and then put it appropriately for what, you know, some services shouldn't be remote, should only be in person. Other services, you know, you might think that actually just sending a note is sufficient. And so that would allow the Medicare program to customize the type of service and level of service for every individual beneficiary as needed.
Thank you very much. That sounds like an enormous task for us to complete in the next year, but it's good direction. Another area of discussion today is how Congress is working with the administration to support Medicare innovation and technology, particularly with the recent TSET framework release. Dr. Aklog, can you, thank you for your moving testimony. Can you please describe how Congress can help improve the TSET proposal and what areas of the framework are companies like yours excited about?
Thank you, Congresswoman. I'll start with the second question. We're just excited to be here. We're excited that Congress is engaged and that this is bipartisan, and we all are looking for the same thing, to have patients have access to this, these life-saving innovations. Both the HR 1691 and TSET, you know, are a step in the right direction, and we'll work to improve the process. Many of the areas for improvement have been covered here today, so I'll just sort of rattle them off again, just to for completeness. As I think I've said already twice, the omission of diagnostics is really not reasonable. We need as much streamlining, we need as much transparency and predictability in that space, and the opportunities to have an impact are just as great. One thing that is not in TSET that was in prior rules was automatic coverage. Without automatic coverage, the predictability aspects of the process get quite diminished. Going in, especially as a small company that's raising capital, going into a process knowing that you might fail, but knowing that if you're successful and the criteria are clear, that there's not uncertainty at the end of the road. So that's really important. We talked about the quotas and the resource allocations and the five slots a year. That's, again, not workable. It doesn't follow the pace of innovation, and it pits patient groups against each other. The defined benefit category, also an issue. You know, we have 21st century innovations, and we have a defined benefit category system that's many decades old. They have to be aligned.
Thank you very much. My time went over. I apologize. I yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Bilirakis, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you again and the ranking member for holding this critical hearing on medical innovation and the need to ensure that Medicare beneficiaries have access to treatments and cures being developed for patients in need, particularly those who have debilitating, life-threatening diseases that no alternatives exist. And while drugs have historically had a pathway forward, devices too often get lost in bureaucracy. That's why I'm proud to help lead the Ensuring Patient Access to Critical Breakthroughs Products Act, HR 1691, with my bipartisan colleagues, again, Representative Cardenas, Winstrup, Delbeni, and of course, our chair, Mr. Guthrie, and our ranking member, Ms. Ashew. Our bill will provide a statutory pathway for Medicare coverage for medical devices approved by the FDA under the Breakthrough Devices Program. We want to expand upon and strengthen the policies recently laid out by CMS in their proposed transitional coverage for emergency technologies, TSET guidance, recently released. But I would be remiss if I didn't express disappointment that TSET doesn't go further and only expands Medicare access to only a small number of innovative devices under the existing national coverage determination pathway compared to the now repealed MCIT rule. So my questions are, let's see, Dr. Miller first. I understand that there are vastly different levels of expertise and staffing resources between FDA Device Review Group and the Medicare Coverage Group at CMS, which has a much smaller footprint of medical experts on staff. Can you elaborate on the respective roles of the FDA and CMS and whether CMS should develop a means to harness external expertise without overstepping its statutory role, such as unnecessarily requiring duplicative studies redundant to what the FDA has already required? If you could answer that, I'd appreciate it, sir.
Thank you. So the FDA ensures that products are safe and effective. The CMS ensures that they're reasonable and necessary for the Medicare population. So the FDA device the FDA approved or cleared device may or may not be tested in a population that's exactly representative of the Medicare population. So that's one issue where the FDA and CMS working together could improve that. We have the parallel review program, which is a good effort, but unfortunately operationally hasn't really changed that. I think that the problem is as I said, CMS has a variety of tools and it doesn't use them. It has the Medicare Evidence Coverage or Evidence Development Coverage Advisory Committee, which is 100 members. They haven't had many. They had, I think, 14 meetings of that over the past 10 years, even though the charter says 2 to 4. And when it was first set up in 2000, they had 6 meetings in that first year. So they have the external experts. They've recruited them, screened them. When I joined, and I'm no longer a member, I did, I think, 263 pages of paperwork. So it's not exactly a low entry barrier. You have to undergo ethics screening. So CMS has those tools. They just have chosen not to use them. That's why I think they need to have a statutory requirement for issuing guidance as to when they use which tool, when they're going to do an LCD, when they're going to do an NCD, guidance for when they convene an outside technical assessment, guidance for when they convene the MedCAC, and then timelines for each of those.
Thank you. Along similar lines in the policies being put in place by CMS with TSET, there are also bipartisan concerns surrounding the NCD for beta amyloid reduction treatments for Alzheimer's disease. Ms. Wronski, you mentioned in your testimony that the coverage with evidence development, CED determination, that CMS has decided for a fully FDA-approved drug has never been put in place before. Can you speak to the need for CMS to reconsider putting up these barriers and replace it with the NCD that makes patient access as easy as possible when it's medically necessary? I, too, have a loved one with mid stages of Alzheimer's. And, of course, I have a lot of constituents that unfortunately were diagnosed with Alzheimer's. If you could answer, I appreciate it.
Thank you, Congressman, for the question, and we appreciate your support on the issues as well. I think I just need you to repeat the question one more time.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
Well, we're time's
Can you
past
speak to
time.
the need for?
Hey, Mr. Miller, we're about to have 30 seconds over time. Can we pick it up?
All right, I'll actually
Thank you,
state it for the
Congressman.
record. I appreciate it very much. I yield back.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Dr. Schreier for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member Eshoo. Thank you to all of our witnesses for being here today. Just a heads up, Dr. Aklog, this question will be for you. Diabetes management technologies have seen some great advances in recent years with technologies like insulin pumps, although I've been on one for like 30 years, continuous glucose monitors, and closed-loop systems that combine these technologies together. And CMS in recent years has worked to improve coverage for these devices, but has significantly lagged private insurance. Now, looking forward, digital software-based technologies hold a great deal of promise in helping people to even better manage their diabetes. In fact, I use software, an app on my phone that connects my continuous glucose monitor with the pump on my leg. And even if I am running between hearings and forget to take insulin or my sugar goes low, it knows what to do. It will slow down insulin or it will bump it up. And this is really the next frontier. Like, I think the next frontier is going to be that you don't necessarily buy a whole system that goes together. You buy the CGM that you like and you buy the pump that you like, and what you need next is the thing that links the two together, which is not a medication, and it's not a device in the traditional sense. But this sort of thing doesn't have a pathway through the FDA, but this is definitely kind of FDA-related tangential and certainly works with medications. So TSET, as proposed, really wouldn't have a benefit here. So I was wondering if you could just comment on how this might impact these type of technologies and how quickly they can become available to people on the market, and whether people are going to have to circumvent the FDA, which can sound a little Wild West and dangerous, or what needs to happen at the FDA to keep up with the next frontier of medicine.
That's such a great question, Dr. Schreier, and I thank you for asking it. We're pretty far into this hearing, and it's, we've heard a lot about valve disease and Alzheimer's. It's great to hear about another scourge that we're dealing with, which is diabetes. And it's also a really important question because it goes to the heart of the issue of fitting square pegs in round holes. We have diabetes, as you said, has a lot of device technology, but also a lot of software technology and monitoring technology, all of which are coming together in very remarkable ways that are taking advantage of a host of technological innovations. And we have a system that has defined benefit categories that are not really defined along those ways. I think on the FDA side, I think there's hope. I think that there's certainly been conversations and at least an acknowledgement that the digital health revolution is not just coming, it's here, and that FDA has to upgrade its approaches to how it addresses these things. So I think there's hope, and I think there's dialogue there that I see progress on. I think on the coverage side, that's a problem because of the defined benefit category issue.
Well, that will get lots of letters from my office, probably with co-signatures from a lot of my colleagues here. But you bring up an interesting point. Like, we've heard a lot about how overworked and overstretched the FDA is right now. How there already isn't enough staff to keep up with the demand. And this calls into question, you're going to need a whole new category of people and a whole new sort of pathway for approval. Do you have, and this can go to you, this can go to Dr. Brinton, just needing more research and clinical expertise, how do you think we're going to fill those roles, and where are we going to look for them?
Thank you for the question, Representative. I think that, as innovation drives forward, we're going to find all sorts of different platforms for technology, digital being one of them, but you think about material science, AI, there's going to be a whole plethora of different technology platforms that we need expertise within FDA, but also within CMS. And so allowing them to be able to hire or recruit those experts as advisors to bring in that expertise, I think is fundamental to the process. I think we have to have that expertise at the agencies to make good, informed decisions.
I think so too, having that independent hiring authority. Thank you, and with 15 seconds left, I will yield back.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair will recognize Dr. Brinton for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thanks for holding today's hearing, and thanks to all the witnesses. I really believe this is a great hearing because this is a critical issue. And I honestly think in the healthcare space, this is one of the most important challenges that we're all going to face, and we are facing, how we address approval and payment for innovative products. The United States possesses the most innovative pharmaceutical and medical device manufacturers in the world, and as a result of the innovative treatments, therapies, cures, and devices, patients are able to live longer and healthier lives. And as a physician, I believe that we must ensure that federal policies support maintaining this leadership, and that the federal government doesn't inhibit innovation or unnecessarily restrict access for patients. And we've heard some of that today. Unfortunately, the lack of timely and appropriate pathway for reimbursement by CMS in the form of coverage decision plays an outsized role in whether or not patients can access a drug or device once it's approved by the FDA, as we've heard today. And it's even a factor in decisions about whether or not people will invest the capital in attempting to develop a drug or device due to the lack of predictability about reimbursement. We've also heard that today. But I'm going to focus on another issue with Dr. MacGillivray. And I know you mentioned this in more depth in your written testimony, but one of the key ingredients for innovative coverage pathways is data. The STS database has been a gold standard of care for many years. I used it when I was in practice. I believe that clinician-led data registries like the STS database are the way to go as we determine what constitutes quality care. These clinician-led registries can be even better with access to Medicare claims data to help better track patient outcomes and assess the effectiveness of treatments and therapies. Section 105B of MACRA, the Medicare and CHIP Reauthorization Act, was passed to help provide access to this data, but CMS has refused, essentially, to provide meaningful access. This is why Dr. Schreier, who just spoke, and I introduced the meaningful access to federal health plans claims data in the last Congress. Can you talk to that? Can you talk about why getting access to this data is so important for driving quality and better patient outcomes?
Thank you, Dr. Brinton, for that question. You know, as the pioneer of quality improvement, Edwards Deming once said, "In God we trust, from everyone else we require data." And that the STS databases have really been very impactful at capturing data for cardiac surgery. With that risk-adjusted data, we can help individual surgeons, programs, and the whole country make the quality of cardiac surgery care better. But we're handcuffed by our registries only go to 30 days. We have over 9 million patient records. If we had the ability to, in real time, cost efficiently and affordably, have access to claims data, we could demonstrate over time efficacy of the treatments and quality and value of care by lower cost.
Do you have any indication of why this has been a challenge to get this data, even from CMS? I mean, they're not statutory. MACRA is requiring them to help with this. Why that's not working?
I wish I knew.
Yeah. It's the government. I could say that, I guess. Punt to that, right? Dr. Rost, in recent guidance CMS provided to treating physicians, CMS stated that physicians will get the usual Medicare payment and cost sharing to administer Leqembi. Is that how you pronounce it? And you may have already answered this, but when you submit a valid claim and information to help answer treatment questions in a qualifying study, as a physician who may interact with the Quality Net portal, what outstanding questions must CMS clarify to create confidence that the medicines and the necessary diagnostic and imaging tests will be covered by the Medicare program? Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
You're referring to the CED pathway. That's the one that we've been submitting the request for reconsideration, particularly for the patients who already fit the inclusion criteria of what we consider to be peer-reviewed, evidence-driven,
Right.
Evidence of benefit and safety. And so we still have questions with regard what the process is going to be, and so we're asking for more transparency in terms of what the process will entail and where does that actually end for those patients who accrue real-world data that addresses the questions of efficacy and safety with the passage of time. So that's the off-ramp. That's another approach that we advocated for. And we also wanted to make sure that this process is more nimble. Because, for these patients, as we've heard so many times today already, we just don't have time for them to wait for the, to access.
Thank you for that, and my time has expired.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Dr. Ruiz for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for being here today. I'd like to take some time to talk about not just how to ensure the Medicare program can operate more effectively, but also how it could be better structured to address the very real and present equity gaps in our healthcare system. This year, it is estimated that over 1 million Medicare beneficiaries will be diagnosed with cancer. Many of these will be late-stage cases where the prospect of successful treatment is slim. There is a real unmet need when it comes to our ability to catch cancer sooner. That's the goal of cancer screening. Catch it sooner, you're better able to remove it, to treat it, so it doesn't get to the dangerous, life-threatening stages. And as a doctor and as an emergency physician, especially, I've seen far too many cases that were detected much later than they should have been or they could have been. Late-stage cancer doesn't impact everyone equally. Studies show that Black and Latino and Latina patients are far more likely to have their cancers detected at later stages and thus have lower survival rates. And I've studied this ad nauseum throughout my medical school, public health education, residency training, etc. I conducted some field research in my district prior to running for Congress, and a lot of those barriers include affordability, include a lack of infrastructure or a provider shortage crisis, lack of transportation, lack of educational outreach, or healthcare literacy due to unfamiliarity with health protocols and treatments. But for decades, we've been stuck with limited cancer detection resources and virtually no means to detect some types of cancers, such as pancreatic, liver, and stomach, at an early stage. As powerful and life-saving as they are, the currently recommended screenings we do have available, such as mammograms and colonoscopies, are only able to detect 5 specific types of cancers. This is now changing. Multi-cancer early detection screenings are blood tests with the potential to detect dozens of cancers at once. But for seniors and Medicare to benefit from these multi-cancer screening tools, first we need to act. Medicare currently is not able to cover tests like these in a timely manner, even after they are approved by the FDA. Congress can fix this issue and make sure seniors are not left waiting. Along with Representative Hudson, Arrington, and Sowell, I have spearheaded a bipartisan bill known as the Nancy Gardner-Sowell Medicare Multi-Cancer Early Detection Screening Coverage Act that would make the necessary changes to the law to strengthen Medicare so it can cover this technology. So I urge this committee to give this bill priority and advance a popular bipartisan solution that addresses this pressing unmet need, Mr. Chairman. Our legislation has garnered broad support in just a few short months since it was reintroduced. In the previous Congress, it had the support of 258 bipartisan House members and 55 bipartisan Senate sponsors. And already this year, we have the support of more than 160 members across the House and the Senate and across the aisle, including over half of this committee. So it is our duty and responsibility in Congress to ensure Medicare is there for those who have contributed to and rely on it. This includes ensuring Medicare patients are able to access the most innovative technologies in cancer detection. So, Dr. Brinton, can you address the importance of making sure that there are pathways for coverage of new innovative products and tests that will help reduce disparities in health outcomes?
So thank you for the question. I think you get from my earlier testimony, we're very passionate about patients. We're very, patients are at the center of what we do. And I mentioned Jill Poole as a patient who life was completely changed by getting access to a early therapy that was within the early feasibility trial stage at Edwards. And so absolutely the mechanism to not just provide the opportunity to be involved in clinical trials, but access to ultimately get to meaningful coverage is essential to actually the improvement of all Americans and Medicare recipients. You know, not all things are equal. In a sense, I think the priority should be life-saving therapy, and they should be for not just incremental, but significant impact needs. They should be for unmet clinical needs, and particularly, as you mentioned, disparities in care. That should be the priority.
Yeah, and I think that legislation and implementation should have equity in the forefront as a planning in order to implement it. Unfortunately, too often we implement laws and then react to the fact that they're not reaching those that need it the most. And then we have to reorganize and backtrack, but the damage has already been done. So this is a clear opportunity where we can think through the process in implementing these new innovative technologies that do save lives in a way that ensures that the people that need them the most, those that suffer from high disparities due to these, get them with their fair opportunities and that it's accessible to them. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to our panelists. Thank you all for being here with us. Today's topic is one that really hits home to me. As an IT professional and a patent holder myself, I know the pains that individual Americans and companies go through each day to try and bring their ideas to market. I mean, you think about what has grown the most powerful economy on the planet. Where does innovation, how does ingenuity fit with innovation in the American free enterprise system? Ingenuity rests along that highway between innovation and investment. And for someone to have a great idea and to have the mindset to pursue great ideas, ingenuity, they gotta have some certainty that there's gonna be some payoff, some reward for their work. And when innovation pulls investment, you know, I think back, for example, to the invention of the airplane and the light bulb. Nobody asked for any federal government help, subsidies, incentives, any of that stuff. These were people that put their own money, their own reputation, their own time and energy on the line to make something happen because we had a free enterprise market that promised that if they were successful, then investment dollars are going to follow. But when investment pulls innovation, rather than innovation pulling investment, when it's the opposite direction, when the federal government, through either regulations or laws, begin to influence what is invested in innovation begins to die. And as a result, because of that uncertainty, so does ingenuity. We need to provide businesses with the certainty that once a product is tested and proven safe, there's a reasonable process for getting it to market. In recent years, numerous software products that treat serious diseases have received FDA clearance and approval. These products, prescription digital therapeutics or PDTs, put world-class care at patients' fingertips for afflictions ranging from opioid and substance use disorder to PTSD, ADHD, stroke, eye conditions, and more. While drugs and other products that complete FDA review are then reviewed by CMS for coverage determinations, PDTs do not fit in CMS's existing benefit categories, and the agency's been unable to consider them for reimbursement, thus jeopardizing the ability of patients to receive access to cutting-edge, life-saving treatment. So, Dr. Aklog, American innovation has saved and improved the lives of millions of people, domestically and around the world. Would you agree that in order for companies like yours to continue into the future, we must have a path to reimbursement for products completing the FDA review?
Thank you, Congressman, and I'm sure you're not surprised the answer is an absolute yes. And thank you for highlighting the importance of individual innovators and entrepreneurs and how that ecosystem works, because it does require a level of predictability to get an investment, and it requires knowing what's at the end of the process. The process, as I said, might fail, but if you succeed, you need to know that you have the ability to get to get your products to benefit patients.
Okay. Well, I was pleased to see that CMS included a request for comments on digital therapeutics in the proposed calendar year 2024 Medicare physician fee schedule, including requests for comments on how digital therapeutics could be covered under existing coverage pathways. Dr. Miller, in your opinion, how could CMS use existing benefit pathways for digital therapeutics, which are already being used to pay for, quote, unquote, software as a medical device, to reimburse for those innovative and effective tools?
Excellent question. A couple answers. One is the chronic care condition management codes. CMS could use those to reimburse for software. I think the other thing we need to think about is should software be allowed to compete within the Medicare program? Right? There are some things that we do not need human capital to. We don't have enough doctors. We don't have enough nurses. We don't have enough licensed nurse practitioners. We just don't have enough human capital, and we can't fund enough human capital. So is there a way that we can allow technology into the Medicare fee-for-service program to augment human capital?
Okay. Well, thank you. With that, Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Ms. Trahan for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm grateful to you and the ranking member for holding this important hearing, and thank you to all the witnesses here today. For decades, countless lives have been saved through medical innovation. I appreciate the opportunity to be part of this conversation on how we can improve Medicare coverage pathways for innovative drugs, medical devices, and technologies. We are at a pivotal moment in the course of medical history. New therapies and treatments, including for some conditions that were previously thought untreatable, are being developed and incorporated into commercial use as we speak. However, in order to access this new innovative care, patients need the correct diagnosis so that their providers have the most accurate picture of their disease. And in order to do that, particularly for Medicare beneficiaries, we must ensure that they have access to the best diagnostic tools, including PET scans. When providers have access to these devices that help them get an accurate diagnosis, it's not just patients and families that benefit, the Medicare program as a whole does too, because an accurate diagnosis means Medicare is paying for patients to receive the treatments that they actually need. My home state of Massachusetts is a global leader in medical innovation, and that's especially true in the development of diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals that provide incredible images to diagnose disease. It's for that reason that I'm working with 13 members of this subcommittee to advance the FIND Act, which will ensure that PET scans for Alzheimer's, prostate cancer, and other diseases are available and accessible to seniors. Medicare pays for PET scans differently, depending on the setting in which the scan is provided, but the current system is far from perfect. Dr. Rost, how would more adequate payments for PET scans increase patients' access to care?
Thank you so much, Congresswoman, for recognizing the state of innovation in my own state of Massachusetts. Coming from Massachusetts General Hospital, which is #1 research hospital in the country, I can tell you confidently that many of the personalized diagnostics have been developed in that cradle of science, and I'm very proud to be part of that. Also, as a clinician scientist, I know that providing the tools that were developed through the research pipeline, ultimately becoming the standard of or state of art for diagnostic and clinical care is something that we need to make sure that it's nimble, dynamic, and evolving with the speed that matches the speed of the diseases that we're trying to diagnose with that. So we are very pleased to hear yesterday that the CMS retired the pre-existing coverage determination for the amyloid PET for Alzheimer's disease as of last night. And we're very proud at the American Academy of Neurology to be in those dialogues with the CMS on that topic. I would say, though, that almost 10 years of conversation in this space had gone by, and this is not necessarily this is not necessary to be so behind on advancing this treatment. So these diagnostics are critical. They need to be available to doctors who are taking care of patients in real world.
Great, thank you for that. I couldn't agree more on nimble and agile. And it's important to get the FIND Act across the finish line to address part of that issue. Mr. Brinton, you have a unique perspective on medical device innovation. Based on your background, can you speak to the distinct challenges that smaller companies face when trying to get a product to market? And in your opinion, what additional resources do both FDA and CMS need to help get life-saving innovations to patients?
Yeah, thank you very much for the question. Prior to my life at Edwards, I was an entrepreneur and worked at the Stanford Buyer Center, training people in medical innovation. I think it comes back to the same things we talked about before, which is predictability of the process, that there's a predictable process for everyone, in a sense, a level playing field. That does not guarantee the certainty of the outcome. The fact that you actually know that there's a predictable process and a timeline that's been set up that's actually responsible, that allows you to get to FDA approval and then approach a possible for actual, real payment, meaningful payment that allows you to actually fund the technology, because if you can't fund the technology, you can't get it to patients. So ultimately, I think it's the same whether you're a large company or a small company. I really think it is about a predictable process.
I appreciate that. Lastly, I'm sending a bipartisan letter to CMS urging the agency to address delays in a new benefit category for FDA-approved exoskeleton technology that works to ensure that wheelchair users suffering from a spinal cord injury can perform tasks in their everyday life. And certainly proper coverage and payment for new technologies like exoskeletons improve innovation, and they lead to more patient access and life-saving technology. I thought I had remaining time to yield to you, Ranking. I'm sorry.
It goes too fast, doesn't it? We have so much, it's such an interesting subject, and everybody's dedicated to this, so thank you, and good witnesses. So, Dr. Dunn, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I too am excited to be joined by such an esteemed panel of witnesses to discuss the landscape of American innovation in the life sciences community. Industry has certainly delivered next-generation therapeutics and diagnostics at an impressive rate. But I hear frustrations every day about the inefficiencies and inability of CMS and FDA to keep up with the progress that the clinicians and the scientists are making. I do want to thank my colleagues, Scott Peters and Ms. Trahan, who just spoke, for working with me on one particular policy, and that is H.R. 1199, the FIND Act, which seeks to address an inefficient payment policy related to precision diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals. I have seen the utility and potential of advanced diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals firsthand. These tools are important for early diagnosis as well as treatment planning. Accurate diagnosis saves lives. For example, in the Alzheimer's space, the IDEAS study demonstrated that scans utilizing diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals led to physicians to change their care management for patients in 60% of cases. Package payments for those important tools, unfortunately, currently limit their access for Medicare population. The FIND Act would improve that payment for diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals and incentivizing their use when appropriate. And I'd like to ask the chair to include the IDEAS study in the record. Thank you very much. We've been focusing on dementia in this example, but in my specialty, urology, the advances in CT, PET scanning, and cancer, both diagnostics and therapeutics, is perhaps even more dramatic. The wholesale imposition of prior authorizations, fail first-step therapies, and inadequate reimbursements have been crippling our continued progress in our clinics. My message to CMS would be simply this: healthy patients save money, and they add to the sum total of human capital. Another issue which I've engaged in CMS is the transitional pass-through payment. When CMS recognizes the value of some transformative technology, they reward such innovation with temporary add-on payments that incentivizes utilization and data collection about the impact of uptake. And I've heard from numerous companies who've received pass-through payment status, but then are placed in limbo when it comes to CMS setting their permanent payment levels. So imagine, if you will, that instead of fighting layer upon layer of bureaucracy, these innovators actually had a cooperative relationship with CMS. Dr. Rost, given your expertise in the Alzheimer's space, would you support an improved payment for advanced diagnostic radiopharmaceuticals? And can you speak to the different experience of patients who have access to advanced diagnostics, how their experience is different from those who don't?
Thank you for this question. There is no doubt that when doctors have access to diagnostics and management options that are applied to real patients in real world, we can do better, informed, earlier, and more impactful decisions. As a neurologist, we know that Alzheimer's disease is just one example of these neurologic disorders that are so important, but there are dozens of others, and the diagnostics that you've mentioned and others that are coming down the pipeline is something that we want to make sure that we have available and ready for these patients to benefit from. Obviously, those individuals who are not able to receive the benefit of the diagnostic will not be able to get the advanced warnings of the disease. And as you mentioned, some of those conditions where you want to be able to highlight the variety of pathology. We're talking only here about beta amyloid, but there are other types of pathology in the brain that can be diagnosed early on and hopefully have ways for prevention.
I couldn't agree more. We're actually talking about curing metastatic prostate cancer now if we get it early enough and treat extra prostatic sites. Dr. Miller, in the remaining 20-something seconds, can you give me some of the practical challenges in facing innovative drug and device companies, recommendation to improve the CMS processes and decrease bureaucratic inefficiencies?
I think the key is transparency of process and a guaranteed process. Right now, it's a little bit of a crapshoot. You don't know what reasonable and necessary is. So if you don't know how you're being graded, how can you perform?
Well, I appreciate that. That was very succinct. Thank you, Dr. Miller. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Dr. Joyce. We have a lot of physicians, as you can hear, the doctors. Dr. Joyce.
Thank you for yielding, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, for convening such a hearing on an important topic, innovation. I have said as a practicing physician and continue to say as a member of this great legislative body that innovation is the cornerstone of American medicine. It is something that patients expect, and we need to make sure that government policy is not a barrier to access to the latest technology and therapies. Breakthroughs, like in areas of gene therapy, the first ever FDA-approved medication for Alzheimer's, and cutting-edge medical devices all need to be able to be in reach of patients for them to be ultimately effective. With both TSET and NCD for Alzheimer's, the Biden administration has created uncertainty and confusion about what might be reimbursed by Medicare and when. Recent decisions regarding IRA implementation have only added to this uncertainty and will continue to stifle innovation. 2 years after withdrawing the Trump administration's MCIT regulation, I was pleased to finally see CMS release the proposed TSET guidance. This represents a first step towards establishing a more predictable and transparent coverage process for Medicare beneficiaries to access new medical devices. However, I'm very disappointed that TSET, as proposed, may expand patient access to only a very small number of innovative breakthrough medical devices and technologies using the existing National Coverage Determination, or NCD, pathway. Dr. Brinton and Dr. Aklog, can you speak on how this proposal differs from the previous MCIT proposal, including how it appears to apply to a smaller set of products seeking full national coverage determination, NCD, especially how the universe of potential products was narrowed to only a subset of breakthrough devices, despite CMS previously suggesting that they would look beyond the breakthrough designation after the repeal of MCIT. Dr. Brinton, I'll ask you to address first.
Yeah, Dr. Joyce, thank you very much for the question. I think that the differences between MSET and TSET are significant. One of the biggest thing was obviously the onset of the plan. So MSET was immediate coverage. Obviously, TSET is actually delayed. It's delayed for 6 months, and as I said earlier, I think that every single day we wait, there's patients that are suffering and not getting the therapies that have actually been proven to be safe and effective. It can be beneficial for the patient population. As far as coverage and the breadth of coverage, I think one of the limitations is the arbitrary choice of 5 TSET candidates per year that allows to go through the process. That's an arbitrary number. As I mentioned earlier, it's not a linear process. You would imagine there's going to be certain amounts of new technology, new breakthrough technologies that come under review at certain points in times and less other times. I'm not sure where the limitation comes from, and it should be about, as I mentioned earlier, the criteria of big impact, life-saving technology should be at the top of the list, in my opinion. Things that actually meet really significant unmet clinical needs, things that actually address disparities of care. Those should ultimately be the actual criteria that actually is addressed first, and it's hard with an arbitrary number of 5 to actually address that directly.
Dr. Aklog, would you agree with what Dr. Brinton just said?
Yeah, I won't reiterate, but I do agree with every point he makes, and the fact that without a predictable path to automatic coverage, these are breakthrough devices that will have received FDA clearance, have been deemed safe and effective.
I think this entire committee, and I think you as witnesses, share in the concerns that certain medical technologies have been in coverage with evidence development, CED, limbo, for over a decade. I understand that it's also taken an average of 16 months for CMS to remove the CED requirements after requests have been made by manufacturers, if they're even removed at all. Dr. Miller, understanding that different medical products will have different features, the different risk factors, patient populations, and bodies of evidence, should policymakers consider a practical sunsetting of CED after some period of time? And would more clear criteria for termination of CED actually help increase access for patients?
Absolutely. We've heard that registries and trials and having the continuation of that collection of data is incredibly burdensome and also inequitable for patients. So I think providing statutory guidance for CMS with timelines is what is needed. That's going to sort of unclog the bureaucratic machine.
And I think it's so necessary as my time expires that we need to be, as a body, unclogging that bureaucratic machine, unclogging access, allowing patients the innovation which truly is the cornerstone of American medicine. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I yield.
Thank you. The gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Carter from Georgia for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank all of you for being here. I know it's been a long day, but we appreciate this. This is extremely important. Folks, I'm the oldest pharmacist in Congress, and the youngest one is sitting in front of me over here. But there are 2 of us, and both of us agree that drug prices are too high, and we know the problem. And I don't speak for my colleague, but I think she would agree that the problem is the middlemen, the PBMs, the pharmacy benefit managers. As you can tell, and I'm not going to go into my usual spiel, but I'm not a fan of PBMs. I'm not a fan of any group that does not bring value to the healthcare system, and I don't believe they bring value to the healthcare system at all. I believe all they do is profit and pocket those profits. But nevertheless, one of the problems is the link between PBM compensation and the price of medicines. In fact, you're familiar with spread pricing. I suspect all of you are familiar with that, where they pay one thing and then they charge another price, much higher price. In fact, the state of Ohio is now suing a PBM as a result of the spread pricing that took place in that state. And the Attorney General described the PBMs as being gangsters, and they are. And that, you know, I'm sorry, that's just all there is to it. But I want to tell you about a bill I've got. It is a bipartisan bill that Representative Lisa Blunt Rochester and I have introduced. It's called Protecting Patients Against PBM Abuses Act. And what it does is to de-link the PBM compensation from medicine prices in Part D. And instead, it implements just a flat fee-based model, which I think would work much better. Dr. Miller, you're familiar with PBMs and the way that they, I suspect, and the way that they practice. Do you believe, or do you agree that the current PBM compensation model including the use of spread pricing in public health programs, incentivizes PBMs to put higher priced medicines on the formulary, potentially limiting access to lower cost medicines?
Yes, it can definitely be problematic.
Yes, it can. And it is problematic, and I appreciate you acknowledging that. Anyone else want to speak on that? Anyone else hate PBMs as much as I do? No, I doubt that.
As a patient.
Yeah, the other pharmacist does, but nevertheless. Yeah. Well, again, this is extremely important, and I hope that I hope you'll look at this bill, because this is one of the many ways that we feel like we can address this situation. Now, very quickly, I want to switch my attention to Alzheimer's, because this is another pet project of mine, if you will, and I've witnessed it firsthand in my family. I've witnessed it, obviously, as a healthcare professional and treating patients in my pharmacies, and I know what an awful, awful disease it is, and it impacts almost 7 million Americans every year, and that are living with this heartbreaking disease. I was encouraged to see recently that we've got some progress in the world of medicine and the world of drugs, that finally we got a new class of Alzheimer's treatments that'll give families hope, and they need hope. God bless them, they need hope. Not only those who are suffering from it, but the caretakers. Let's always keep them in mind. The caregivers are suffering just as much, and well, they're suffering as well, and that's something we have to be cognitive of. They have hope that this will give them more quality time with their loved ones before the disease takes hold, but that time will most likely not be extended if the CMS does not open the national coverage determination to ensure access to more patients. Dr. Ross, can you speak to how requiring provider and patient participation in a registry may impact people living with dementia, particularly those living in rural and underserved communities?
Thank you, Congressman, for this question. As you know, we have submitted a request for reconsideration of the NCD criteria with the CMS, particularly as refers to the CED requirements. Under the current pathway, there's two patient populations where some of the patients that we believe fit the well-established evidence-based criteria for treatment should be excused from the CED pathway and allowed to receive the medication as appropriate. For other patients who will be undergoing the CED pathway, we believe that they should have an off-ramp procedure. As the evidence is gathered for those patient populations, they should have a determinate opportunity to receive treatment without the burden of data entering in the real world.
Well, I couldn't agree with you more. This is a bad enough situation, and just an awful situation, and to have to deal with this on top of it is just something that I think is unnecessary. So thank you for that.
And if you would allow me,
yes,
I would
please.
Also say with regard to the rural access to neurologists, I would say that one of the more pressing issues is actually shortage of physicians. In this case, neurologists who are the specialists who are specifically trained to diagnose and treat this disorder. So anything that the American Academy of Neurology can do working with the Congress to improve our current situation with the workforce, particularly neurologists, would be happy to engage.
And of course, that also stresses the importance of telemedicine as well. So thank you. Thank you very much, and I yield back.
Hey, thanks. The gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Harshbarger for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel, for being here. This has been, I've taken a lot of notes today. Well, it's green. Is it on? Can you hear me? Maybe I need to put it toward my mouth. Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Miller, I'll start with you. Americans should not have to rely on a health bureaucracy and politicians to determine the value of innovation and whether or not to cover a medical product. Yet, in Medicare, that is exactly what happens. And we often hear that Medicare has to cover something before private insurers do so. And I see that in the pharmaceutical world in a lot of cases. But it shouldn't be necessarily true. Insurance companies should have incentives to cover products that either, one, reduce overall cost or make them more competitive by improving access to patients. Or if a product meets this criteria for commercial payers, it seems to me that the same benefits should apply to Medicare. So how would it improve the Medicare program if there were a mechanism to ensure access for treatments covered by a substantial portion of the commercial market?
It would actually reduce bureaucratic barriers to entry, right? If the commercial market says that for a certain population, covering a drug, device, or service even makes sense, and CMS has a pathway to do that and decide that that's relevant for the Medicare population, it could increase access much faster, right? Because why redo the evaluation if it's already been done before?
Yeah, there's a lot of redundancies in a lot of these programs. I've come to that realization. There's a section of the Social Security Act that prohibits the Secretary from covering items or services under Medicare Parts A or B that are not reasonable and necessary for the diagnostics and treatment of illness. And it provides the Secretary the authority to determine whether or not something's reasonable or necessary. So I guess this is my question. How do innovators and regulators interpret the reasonable and necessary definition? And does this reasonable and necessary definition need greater clarity? And I'll start with you, Dr. Brinton, because I think I know what your answer is going to be. I've written it down like 40 times.
Predictable process.
Yeah.
Let me say that again. Look, I think that the burden for the FDA, safe and effective, and for CMS, reasonable and necessary, are different. And what we've all really talked about here, TSET, or a GAP proposal, provides the opportunity to actually generate data using CED to fulfill a requirement that's different than actually safe and effective. So we think that data evidence is important. It's really guided the development of TAVR. From first generation to where we are today, TAVR is not the same as it was when it came out in the United States 11 years ago. It's evolved tremendously, and that's been a result of the fact we've been able to get data access. And so despite the fact that there are some limitations and it can be burdensome, it's trying to reduce the burden on that. So I think this provides the opportunity to actually provide coverage at the time that you can then gather data to meet the burden actually reasonable and necessary.
Exactly. Dr. Aklog, you specifically say you want diagnostics and you think they should be covered, and I totally agree. For one, it's hard to plan. It's hard to raise capital. You can't do that. But how much money would we save in the long run if they put these innovations out there and let the patient try them? Because honestly, do we have data on that?
I think you're touching on an important issue, which is that once you've established safety, particularly for an early stage tool, that there is an opportunity to offer it to patients while effectiveness data is being collected, and the key there is establishing safety. In many diagnostics, including ours, patients are not getting tested. And so they're false positives and false negatives have a much lower risk because the alternative is to do nothing. So I think there is an opportunity to accelerate that process, because patients are dying every year. If it's a 2 or 3 year path to get to that point of coverage, then thousands of patients would have died.
Honestly, I see that all the time. So the very bureaucratic agency who requires all this data and this evidence development process to protect the patient is the very agency who makes it the end user, who is the patient, suffer and wait an average of 11.5 years to get these products to market to where you can use them. So how much? I mean, it's unbelievable. I was talking to you, Dr. Brinton, before. It is give that patient, based on the unmet clinical needs because of the disparities of care, you want a predictable process. If you know the rules of the game, you can get there a lot quicker, can't you? You can save money in the long run. There's a lot of things that need to be changed, and I think you are just the panel to help us do this. So, my time is up. I had other questions, but I yield back my time, Mr. Chair.
The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes Dr. Miller Meeks for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I thank all of our panel for being here. Last year, Republicans had a Healthy Future Task Force chaired by Representative Guthrie, and I was the chair of the modernization sub of that committee. We discussed artificial intelligence, innovative technology, wearable devices, and how rapidly we could advance both better treatment options and also prevention in healthcare through both personification or personalized drugs, medical devices, both internal and external, and would be able to prevent disease, save lives, and promote healthy behaviors. And an example of what you're talking about, I'm going to show my age and have a discussion when I was in medical school. So I was a nurse prior to being in medical school. I was in the military 24 years. We had a discussion, one of our evening discussions one night was with a cardiologist and a cardiothoracic surgeon at the University of Texas discussing whether or not Medicare should approve CABGs, coronary artery bypass surgery, and if we should even be doing them. The cardiothoracic surgeon said they extend life by 1 year and better quality of life. The cardiologist said it's only 1 year, we should not do it. Imagine. I was asked as a medical student what I thought of that, and I said if we can extend life 1 year and increase productivity, we should absolutely do it because it won't solely be for seniors. And think of all of the young people we have saved by coronary artery bypass surgery. That's what you all are talking about. That's the point you're trying to get across, that we can save lives, better treat chronic diseases, promote healthy behaviors, and prevent disease. So Congress needs to act to make sure Medicare beneficiaries have access to diagnostic tools, including those that detect cancer early. Dr. Aklog, given that seniors are 7 times more likely to get cancer than younger people, and whatever breakthroughs we have with seniors will also relate to younger people, what actions do you think Congress and CMS should consider to ensure seniors are getting their proper screenings?
Yeah, I'm glad again you focused on diagnostics because, as you note, being able to do, we know that early detection works. We know that in other cancers, and we know that in cancers that are where we have new approaches using molecular diagnostics to do so. So, Congress and CMS just have to act and provide us with predictable pathways to take these really groundbreaking molecular diagnostic technologies and use them for this purpose.
And Dr. Brinton, having been a trauma nurse and an operating room nurse, I have seen the advances. And when you talked about our transcatheter valve replacements, what an amazing thing. I have a brother who had open heart surgery at 2 years old for a patent for him in a valley. When CMS repealed the MCIT rule, they indicated other devices outside of the breakthrough program may benefit from this TCET coverage pathway, but it appears that CMS ultimately narrowed the criteria more than the MCIT policy. How should policymakers think about the breakthrough designation as a proxy for truly innovative devices and technologies? And what other features or designations should Congress or CMS consider when providing a predictable coverage pathway to innovative technologies?
Thank you very much for the question. I hate to repeat myself, but I'm going to. I think that, as our prioritization, innovation overall, there's a lot of ways you can think about bringing new things, new products, new technologies to patients. But the prioritization needs to be life-saving technologies, large, unmet, significant clinical needs. It needs to be addressing, not incremental needs, but very significant needs, and it needs to be addressing disparities of care. Those should be the top priorities. And whether you call that breakthrough status, whether you call it emerging technologies, or you label it something, the reality is we need to actually move the resources to where we can have the biggest effect on patients. And so my belief is that's in that order.
I'm going to thank you for that, and then I'm going to have a sidebar in response to one of our colleagues' comments on how we use real-world evidence. And I'll just give an example of that. The Doctors Caucus sent a letter to the FDA in 2021 talking about the duration of time between the COVID-19 vaccines and how the time should be expanded based upon real-world evidence. So when we're talking about real-world evidence, we're talking about not just randomized control studies, but all of that information that comes after a drug has been approved, whether it's here in the United States or abroad. Thank you so much for your testimonies. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair recognizes Mr. Crenshaw for 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talk about a lot of things in our healthcare system: affordability, quality, accessibility, and we often miss one crucial element, but it should stand out, which is innovation. And the United States proudly leads the world in this regard, offering innovative products and treatment options that truly save lives on a global scale. Of course, this does seem to be despite the efforts of the FDA and CMS to quell that innovation. Luckily, our innovators continue on. They press on. They ask for more rounds of fundraising and investments for their small startups in order to get FDA approval. They keep trying despite the obstacles, and it's noteworthy that nearly half of all spending in healthcare occurs in the second half of our lives when Americans are on Medicare. So older Americans must have access to the latest technologies. You know, it's been talked about plenty, and I guess I'll just have to beat the dead horse. But on the diagnostics, prompt diagnosis not only saves lives, but also curtails healthcare spending. And so it's baffling to see the recent rulemaking for transitional coverage for emerging technologies, that diagnostic technologies were overlooked. It's astonishing that we're not expediting coverage, as diagnosing illnesses is a fundamental aspect of healthcare. Dr. Aklog, what would be the impact of not including diagnostic technology in this expedited coverage option?
I think it would be a big loss. Patients will suffer. We won't have the ability to use these technologies to save lives. I'll give one quick example, as you mentioned, as it relates to cost. Early detection of esophageal precancer, the cost of that relative to someone who presents with stage 1 or even more advanced cancers is more orders of magnitude greater. There's new data out that suggests that the cost of treating esophageal cancer is approaching 7 figures per patient. So early detection definitely has an impact, and the only way to do that is to use these amazing tools that we have that molecular biology has provided to us.
You know, I want to go back to the FDA, because you can't have a full conversation here if we don't talk about the FDA approval process. But the FDA is overloaded. It's easier to say no when you're a bureaucrat, let's be honest. And there are serious unnecessary delays in a lot of approvals that I'm seeing, you know, especially from companies in my own district. When they finally do get that green light, they have another uphill battle with CMS approval as well. Dr. Miller, you talked about this in your testimony. Can you lay out some options that we might consider to improve the efficiency on the FDA approval side?
Thank you. Great question. 2 things. One is the 510K third-party review program, sort of neglected, living alone by itself in Silver Spring on campus. It's a way that you can offload simple 510K applications to a recognized organization, which reviews it and ships it back to the FDA. There are a series of things we can do to tune up that program, make it more efficient, so that way the FDA reviewers can focus on the complex applications and giving guidance to industry and more engagement to industry who needs it for those applications. The second thing is Dr. Schreier mentioned a digital world, which is something that I support, and that's sort of the next stage of medical innovation, blending software and hardware. The FDA regulatory framework is completely inadequate to deal with that, partially because we haven't given them the tools. So they're using a risk-based regulatory framework dating back to 1976, and it's 2023, so no surprise it doesn't work. One of the things that we could do is fit-for-purpose pathways, one for software as a medical device, another for those hardware-software combination products. I would call them integrated devices. You could have products that are broken down to components. They meet a consensus standard. They're tested in a third-party accredited lab. And they meet those standards, and then the actual FDA reviewer, the human capital, sits there and does a second stage holistic review. That way you don't have a reviewer, the limited human capital that we have, looking at all the components of a device. So making it simple and saying what can meet a standard, and then what does the human capital need to do.
Yeah, there's so many problems, they're hard to list. I mean, I hear from innovators in Houston and their dealings with the FDA, and it's a nightmare. This is a broken system. I mean, they've got reviewers who are an MD but are never been a practicing physician, and they're making statements that are completely out of sync with what every other practicing physician would know to be true. I won't get into specifics, but I probably will bring it to the attention of the committee when we're ready. I appreciate your testimony. I appreciate you laying out some solutions to a problem that is ultimately causing American lives, I mean, to be lost, because when these innovations are not allowed out, American lives are lost. And I yield back. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back. I thank the gentleman for yielding back. I thank all the witnesses for being here. That concludes everybody who's been present to ask questions. The ranking member has asked to do a closing, kind of make some closing comments, and I'll just do that as unanimous consent. I assume there's no objection, so you're recognized.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to once again thank the witnesses. I think that this has been an excellent hearing. I've learned a great deal from you, and I think that that's really what hearings are for. I appreciate my colleagues' concerns about access to Alzheimer's treatments, and but I want to highlight a major achievement in the Inflation Reduction Act that will make sure that seniors have access to these innovations. The word innovation has dominated this hearing, legitimately so. And I think the state of innovation in the United States of America is at an all-time high. We don't have a problem there. But we want to make sure that it continues to be robust and that it reaches people. But as policymakers, the policy is central, obviously, to us, because we're the ones that are shaping that. But you can have the best policies in the world, but if the product doesn't reach people because they can't afford it, then it's a collapse across the board. And for Alzheimer's patients, we put in place the $2,000 cap on out-of-pocket costs. That is going to affect all of our constituents, whether they're Republicans, Democrats, independents. And that's going to save Alzheimer's patients on the newly approved Leqembi more than $3,000 annually when that's put into place. So I think that is important to restate. Wasn't stated anywhere during the hearing. And again, to each one of you, thank you. Dr. Miller, it seems to me that we've got to make sure that you meet with some of the key people in the agency. I don't know if they have considered your responses to questions. You gave very practical things that to be put into place. And I don't view these agencies as being groups of evil people. And most frankly, neither do my constituents or constituent companies. They're willing to work with the agencies, roll up their sleeves, and so often make important recommendations to them on how to do it better. So I wish we would stay away from this, let's just smash them over the heads. These are bad people. They're, I don't think we get anywhere with that. I don't think that's an intelligent approach to all of this. Let me just put it that way. Right. So I think that you have really advanced the case on what else we need to do to make sure that these extraordinary innovations that are brought forward are to the benefit that every American. And when America innovates, these innovations are for the betterment of humankind, because what we do, because we lead, people around the world become the beneficiaries of. So thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for allowing me a couple of minutes to say so.
And if I have a couple of minutes there's no objection.
Happy to.
Just to close, thank you all for being here, and what powerful stories. We've so much policy comes from people coming and telling their family stories. We're all part of, Congress is a good reflection of the American people, and we have the same stories in our family, dealing with one myself. So thanks for doing that. And just on the, the $2,000 out of pocket, I don't remember what the number we had in the original bill was bipartisan, and then that, I know it in a separate bill, so we both agreed on capping out of pocket costs through the program. I know that it was in a different bill. We did agree to that. That's a fact. We did. I mean, you can do that, but it was true. And on the Inflation Reduction Act, I mean, we want it all affordable. We want it to be available. We've already had companies come to us and say that the 9-year launch. It said that if we'd like to launch early and we have high capacity, and I won't get into this one since you touched on it, and just closing, we have like, you know, you launch early in stage 4 because that's where you can learn the most. But then as the drugs improve as you move forward, and somebody mentioned earlier they may launch in Europe first because they don't want to start the 9-year clock. And so we just want to make sure that we are hearing those kinds of things moving forward. And we need to have a more drawn out hearing on that so we can bring that up. But since you brought it up, we are concerned about the innovation that's going to come because of that piece of legislation. But thanks so much for being here. This is important, and we all want innovation and to see improvement. And I know you have it coming right out of the middle of your district at Stanford University, and we see it everywhere, and it's nice to have. But I do ask unanimous consent to insert in the record the documents included on the staff hearing documents lists. Without objection, we'll move forward with that. So ordered. And then I want to remind members that they have 10 business days to submit questions to the record, so you can still receive questions for the record, and I ask that you will respond promptly to those questions, and members should submit their questions by the close of business on August the 1st. There is a vote on the floor for the full house, so we're going to probably run out here instead of like usually get a chance to shake your hand and thank you for being here, but we're going to go to the floor. So without objection, the subcommittee is adjourned. Thank you.
All right.
Great job.
That was pretty well prepped, huh? How long has it been? Holy shit. Let's see, 3 hours? It felt like more than 3 hours. It is remarkable, besides, you know, some of the minor theater, that they actually get along better. They get along better than they, despite some of the posture, they get along better than you might think, right?
Thank you, doctors. Thank you.
Space stuff is an innovation. Thank you, Congressman. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you for kind words.
Thank you. Pleasure. Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you for the comments. I appreciate it.
Thank you for your work on this issue. Well, you know, I really did. I was there, actually.
Yeah, great to meet you. Nice to meet you.
I was going to say, apologies we didn't get to chat
No, really,
before.
really relaxing. Very practical.
Yeah, thanks very much.
You know what it is? Yeah, you know what it is. You know what it is for that particular thing. I work in Cedar.
Good work.
Hi, my name is Sarah. I represent the digital therapy.
Oh, nice to meet you. I would have loved to have had more conversation about it. I'm glad several of the representatives brought it up. And some of the actual initiatives I wasn't even aware of. I didn't get a chance to talk about it. We have a digital health subsidiary as well. Cancer care. And we're very focused on some of these regulations. I got concerns about the RPM copay deductible. That's a big issue for us. I'm sure you guys hear all that. Right, the emergency, the pandemic emergency stopped and they came back. You know that deductible, sometimes, we had patients who were on our platform who came up and said, I can't take my deductible for
trash.